morning. Very warm welcome to all of you colleagues, distinguished senior diplomats, friends. A very warm welcome to today's event. I think in the interest of time, it would be better that we proceed with the proceedings of the day. And in order to do that, may I kindly request Your Excellency Ambassador Addis to come to the high table. Your Excellency El Ghassimwan, if you kindly also join us on the high table. Your Excellency Paul Simon Handy. Kevin, please. Your Excellency Kevin. So let me first of all kindly welcome each and every one of you for honoring our invitation at this very busy time of the end of year. I would like particularly to thank Your Excellency Ambassador Addis for honoring our invitation and making time to grace this event with your kind presence, and also as a member of the panel of eminent persons on the review of the APSA and the AGA. We are very delighted to have you here with us today as we take stock of and reflect on the ongoing effort towards the review of the African peace and security architecture and the African governance architecture. I'm also very delighted to welcome online His Excellency Ambassador Janet, former Commissioner for Peace and Security of the African Union and former SRSG and head of various UN missions here on the African continent. A very long-standing African Union, Organization of African Unity, senior official. We are very happy and delighted to have you with us as well. I'm also very happy to have with us the representative of the Principal Secretary of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Kenya, His Excellency Dr. Korir Sungoi, represented here ably by the senior counselor at the Embassy of Kenya here in Addis. Kevin, very warm welcome. Thank you for being here with us. I'm also very delighted to welcome El Ghassimwan, who was the former director of peace and security, the immediate past and last head of mission of the UN mission in Mali, and of course, former chief of staff of the chairperson of the commission of the African Union Commission. I'm also very happy to welcome online Orit, who is the head of the situation room at the African Union Commission, the Continental Early Warning System. Orit Ibrahim is among the key Continental Early Warning System officials who are currently overseeing the strategic review of the Continental Early Warning System. So we are very happy to have Orit with us online as well. I am also very delighted to welcome Paul Simon Handy, my former boss, and also a very dear colleague and senior brother who heads the Institute for Security Studies, the regional office based here in Addis, and representative to the African Union. So, in terms of warm welcome, let me actually thank first and foremost the Embassy of Switzerland, whose collaboration and partnership made the convening of this event possible. We at Amani Africa had the privilege of engaging in a project with the Swiss Foreign Ministry in terms of closely engaging in supporting the ongoing APSA AGA review process with a particular focus of advancing mediation, peacemaking, and conflict prevention efforts. This is one in a series of events that we will be having as part of this engagement, and it forms part of our new area of thematic focus on the primacy of diplomacy for peace as a basis and foundation for advancing a more effective response to the challenge facing the African continent. We are at Amani Africa very delighted at this being the last event of the year to also acknowledge with appreciation all our other partners who have been supporting us in the course of this year and beyond, including the Embassy of Finland, represented here by Ambassador. Thank you very much, Ambassador. The Embassy of Norway, represented by my sister Sen here. Thank you very much again. And of course, the Embassy of Ireland, who have been very generous in making our work possible. Of course, I wouldn't stop, and it would be remiss of me if I do not also acknowledge and recognize the collaboration that we receive from the African Union Commission, the Department of Political Affairs, Peace and Security, and of course, the member states of the African Union in general, and those of the Peace and Security Council in particular. Today's event comes against the background of a journey that the African Union, if we count from June 2015, that the African Union started in June 2015. You may recall in the Johannesburg summit that was held in June 2015, the African Union took some important decisions around advancing ownership of the African Union agenda. And that summit decision took, for the first time, to own, including through financing, the various activities of the African Union. So the decision of the Assembly was to fully fund all 100% the operations budget of the African Union, to fund 75% of the programs budget of the African Union, and 25% of the peace and security budget of the African Union. And that decision triggered the quest for the finding of alternative sources of funding of the African Union. And it was within the framework of that quest for funding of the African Union that a decision was taken that there was also a need for the institutional reform of the African Union. So at the summit in Kigali in 2016, a decision was made to reorganize and make the African Union fit as part of also the decision to identify alternative source of funding. And President Kagame was interested with that task. And you may recall that in January 2017, he presented a report on the institutional reform of the African Union. And that report was the basis for the establishment of the reform unit of the African Union, and also for the rolling out of various assessment of the various organs and entities of the African Union. So it has been 10 years since Johannesburg, 9 years, and we are getting into the 10 year since the start of the institutional reform process. Since President Kagame left, President William Ruto took over the responsibility of championing the institutional reform of the African Union. And within the framework of that institutional reform that President Ruto champions, earlier this year at the African Union Summit in February, a decision was taken for the establishment of a panel of eminent persons made up of representatives of senior seasoned experts and diplomats to provide their insights and expertise in actually advancing particularly the review of the African governance and the African peace and security architectures. Earlier in August, the panel was constituted, and in September, the panel convened its meeting in Nairobi, Kenya, under President William Ruto's hosting. And since then, it has produced its report, and an update report was provided to the AU Assembly during the AU-EU summit in Luanda. That update report was presented by His Excellency President William Ruto. Today, what we will try to reflect on is how did we get to this point? Why does it take this long for finalizing and getting on with the business of delivering on the mandate of the African Union? And where are we in terms of the status update of the institutional reform process? And also whether or not we will see some substantial progress and movement in terms of advancing the review process by the time of the upcoming summit in February 2026. With that overview, I now would like to kindly give the floor to you, His Excellency Mohammed Salah Anadif, who is a member also of the eminent panel of experts. As you know, he is the former foreign minister of Chad, immediate past foreign minister of Chad, but also previously he headed the African Union mission in Somalia. He was also the special representative of the Secretary General to heading the West African office. It is such a pleasure, sir, to have you here with us. And during this morning meeting, we would be happy to hear from you about the process involving the review of the African peace and security architecture, the governance architecture, and the role that you and your peers in the panel have played, and what you think the outcome of this review process would be. The floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup, Dr. Salman. Je voudrais d'abord vous féliciter. Donc, je disais que je voudrais d'abord vous féliciter,
Dr. Solomon, and through you, the entire team of Amani Africa. And for me, the team is doing very important work for the African continent. And I remember in 2014, 2015, the exercises Amani 1, Amani 2, that was definitely something that had a dynamic that was very particular, because in Africa we have structures, we always have institutions. Amani Africa should remain so far, and for me, the way they are remaining even now, it is a very important point to me. And now you are asking me the question to learn what is happening in regards to the reforms of the AU. You've remembered far. The reforms are not a new element to us. Most of the time, we've talked about the reforms of the AU. So for people that are a little bit our age should remember in what idea the Constitution was actually designed. You know, it was signed in Lomé in 2000. This was in very precarious conditions. And this has been designed in the conditions where sometimes we had to compromise. And these type of things they should be reviewed, progressively. And this is something that has been happening so far. As I've said so far, you remember since 2007, even though AU was launched in 2002 in Durban, since 2007, there was a panel through the supervision of the Professor Adebayo. In 2016, the team of Kagame has taken over. They have also done a very important job, especially to the rhythm of our work, the summit, the way we organize our work. I think a very major and important step was definitely taken. And very recently, the President Ruto has taken over. I am actually one of the teams that was a part of the training. We were doing this with the President of the Commission. You've said it so far. We've had two series of meetings, 1st to 5th of September. And recently, from 8th to 11th November, we've also had other meetings, and we have produced some projects that were supposed to be submitted to the summit in Luanda. Now, when you take a look on this process, we are saying that the question of reform is like something that we always talk about. And the diagnostic that we've done in Nairobi, we do not lack pertinent or relevant instruments. And it's not like we are lacking important decisions at the AU level, but we have understood that, unfortunately, when it comes to the implementation of these decisions, that actually depends on the political will. There is definitely a bottleneck somewhere. And for me, I think for us to be able to unravel all these things, I think the change should happen after a major shock. And I think the moment, with everything that we know as a shock, the global level, at the sub-regional level, Africans should really understand that it is time to reform. It is time to act, because the world is moving so fast, and we're observing a lot of shocks. And if we do not do this right now, it might be late. I think Africa has a lot of possibilities, potentials to be able to do all of this. I have major hope with what happened in Nairobi, the report that was presented in Rwanda. It's going to be discussed during the summit in 2026 here in Addis Ababa, I assume. I think this is going to create another level of dynamic. I really have that hope. And again, now to talk about the African peace and security architecture, one of the recommendations from our different meetings is that question of merging APSA with African architecture on governance. And so there is definitely an agreement so far, because of course with the structure of the AU, we've been able to merge the political department, peace and security. So is this a question of harmonizing all these things? And so this is in the idea of recommendations that were supposed to be submitted to the head of states. The question of our methods of work. This is something that should be definitely questioned. The question on early warning, are we following up as it should be? Because among the recommendations, one of them was stating that the continental early warnings should appear to all the programs of our meetings. It could be at the corp level, executive council, each time we should really show that something is happening, because sometimes we tend to feel like we are surprised with things that are happening within our continent. Actually, you have the proof. We have a lot of coup d'etat, and so for me, I think this is one of the shocks that should, bring our attention, or grab our attention, I meant to say. And so when it comes to the reforms in terms of security and peace, I think we should have more harmonization, and everyone knows between the regs and other regional mechanisms, and of course with the AUC, but also we should have at the level of the regs, if you remember, in the years 1990, we had Liberia, Sierra Leone. Hadn't been the leadership of Nigeria, maybe today we would never talk about Liberia or Sierra Leone. And so we need a leadership from each region, and this is very important. Do you remember how, in Lesotho, there was a coup d'etat at the leadership of South Africa and other places? We even remember what happened last Sunday in Benin, the very fast reaction from Nigeria, of course, on behalf of ECOWAS. This helped us to solve the situation. I was in Mali when the coup d'etat happened. The coup d'etat of August 2020, the second coup d'etat, everything that happened in Burkina Faso, everything that happened in Niger. So if we had these kind of reactions very fast, maybe wouldn't be where we are. So we also need to remember that since 2012 in Mali, when there was a coup d'etat, many head of states came to land in Bamako. There were a lot of challenges. The airport was closed, but with all these difficulties, the head of states were able to land. They found the authors, and they promised them, different advantages, different benefits, and finally, we were able to put in place a transition government, and were able to organize elections. And so we have a number of lessons, I meant to say, to make sure that reforms happen. We have practices, we have lessons to learn, and I think we are definitely on a crossroad. We are facing a shock, and I say it, and I'm going to remind you always, in 1999, when we gathered in Algeria for the extraordinary summit, the question to move OAU to AU was actually, in other business discussions. And at the end, we asked ourselves, don't you think it would be important for us to review again the OAU to see where we're trying to go? So this is why afterwards we had the summit in 1999, and it led us to the the design of the other instrument that was reviewed in Lomé and then in Durban in 2002. So I think this is a very important step. So right now, at this moment, most specifically, we really need to do something. We need to observe reforms. As I said earlier, we have good instruments. This is what we understand. But most of the time, the implementation is the issue. And this is why, with the policies that we have, I really hope that the summit that we're going to have in February would help us to go back to the fundamental values, the values that were there when we created the OAU. Again, we're talking about even the instrument on the constitution of AU 2002. And so I think we are pretty much there, and our group is really working harder to make sure we support President Ruto, but also the chairman of the AU. I have a lot of participants here that I'm seeing, and I'm hoping that the work that you're doing, all of you here, that, by the way, captures the context of the environment. I hope that all of this is going to help us to be more aware that it is time to do the reforms so that this efficiency that we've been looking for, we can see it, to make sure also the Pan-Africanism that we're talking about, to make sure we can really do that, and to make sure the AU can really take new steps. This is what I would like to say, and I'm definitely ready to support if it is important, and I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for your for sharing those insights on the role of the panel of eminent persons and the work that has been done so far, particularly the point that you made about the fact that the African Union is well equipped as far as the norms, the normative and policy instruments is concerned. That the gap lies in effective implementation. And the question now is how this review would address and bring about the dynamism required for that effective implementation. Thank you so much. I'm sure there would be questions that we will be addressing later on. Let me now move to the message from Dr. Corey Singoi, Principal Secretary, Department for Foreign Affairs of Kenya. Here we will be hearing from Kevin. Kevin, you have the floor, please. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much. Our host this morning, Dr. Solomon, and of course, the distinguished panel of presenters, excellencies and invited guests, ladies and gentlemen, a good morning to you all. Let me start by expressing my sincere appreciations to you, Dr. Solomon, and Amani Africa for inviting us to this high-profile policy dialogue meeting. As has been introduced, my name is Kevin Thuo, Minister Counselor at the Embassy of Kenya in Ethiopia, and I bring you greetings this morning from our Principal Secretary, Foreign Affairs, Ambassador, or rather Dr. Corey Singoi, who unfortunately could not make it, but he's asked me to read his remarks and comments as far as this high-profile policy dialogue is concerned. So receive his regards and his regrets. The topic this morning, re-energizing conflict prevention and resolution to the review of the African Peace and Security Architecture, APSA, could not be timelier. Though APSA remains a vital framework for the promotion of peace, security, and stability in the continent, the last 10 years have seen significant increase of conflicts in Africa, with the number of armed conflicts in the continent having grown by almost 45% since the year 2020. A grim reminder of this scenario is that out of the 9 conflict situations currently under consideration by the UN Security Council, 5, more than half, are on the African continent. In addition, most of these conflicts are combining with other underlying threats to states like poverty, fragility of states, climate change, youth unemployment, gaps in governance, and social grievances to cause grave and protracted humanitarian situations, including hunger and famine. Our women, children, and the elderly are suffering the most from this obtaining situation. Re-energizing conflict prevention and resolution, as well as reviewing the APSA, therefore, is a necessity in light of the foregoing. Excellencies, to be sure, APSA still remains one of the most comprehensive regional peace and security frameworks globally. And despite some of its challenges, it still represents the ambitions and determination of AU member states to achieve the goal of a conflict-free Africa and to ensure that we do not bequeath the burden of conflicts to the next generations of Africa's sons and daughters. Now, this philosophy remains consistent with the vision and the goal of His Excellency President William Samoei Ruto as the champion of the thank you very much. As the champion of the African Union institutional reforms. You will recall that His Excellency President Ruto, as a champion of the AU reforms, has proposed a number of initiatives to not only aid in the effective workings of the Union, but to also ensure a fit-for-purpose organization that is nimble and adaptable to the rapidly evolving continental security landscape and an unpredictable world order. During His Excellency's address to the Summit of the Government on AU institutional reforms, this was in Luanda last month, President Ruto highlighted the 8 priority areas of reform agenda in line with Assembly Decision 920. Now, these are the revitalization of the peace and security architecture, financing of the Union, operationalization of the African Court of Justice, streamlining the AU agenda format, revamping of the Pan-African Parliament, categorization of decisions, division of labor, as well as the restructuring of the remaining AU organs, institutions, and offices. Allow me, Excellencies, to highlight just 3 of these priorities, which I consider vital to our deliberations this morning. The first, the revitalization of our peace, security, and governance frameworks. Now, as per the report presented by the champion, the recommendation is for the integration of the APSA and AGA into a single coherent framework. It is envisioned that this will eliminate institutional silos, strengthen coherence, and ensure that governance deficits and security challenges are addressed together. An independent panel and a joint task force has also been proposed to develop the merged framework. Now, likewise, a unified system will significantly improve our ability to prevent conflict, manage crisis, and reinforce adherence to AU norms. This includes reaffirming the African Peer Review Mechanism, APRM, as our primary governance monitoring instrument and ensuring stricter compliance with peace and security decisions and membership standards. On his report on the African Standby Force, the champion recommended the expediting of the ASF strategic review, establishing a rapid response component, and creating a counterterrorism brigade. It is further proposed that an 11-member expert committee should develop a roadmap for the full commissioning of the ASF headquarters. This will ensure more rapid and decisive continental responses to emerging security threats and terrorist violence. The champion's report also calls for a stronger linkage between early warning and early response. This calls for the adoption of early action protocols with defined triggers and timelines, and the institutionalization of monthly continental early warning system briefings across the Peace and Security Council, the Permanent Representatives Committee, ministerial forums, and the Assembly. The objective here is to ensure that we transform early warning into predictable early action and reduce the escalation of preventable crisis. The second priority is the AU Peace Fund. The champion's report has proposed increasing the fund from $400 million to $1 billion, diversifying contributions, and engaging African financial institutions and private sector partners. It is further recommended that there is renewed engagement on implementing UN Security Council Resolution 2719 on financing AU-led peace operations. The implication on this one is more predictable, credible, and sustainably financed peace and security system. The last priority that I wish to highlight is the champion's report. In the champion's report, shall I say, is the proposed strengthening of AU norms against unconstitutional changes of government, UCGs. This includes enforcing sanctions rigorously, enhancing the chairperson's good offices, and supporting expedited transitions. This will help restore constitutional order and deter future violations. As I conclude, excellent gentlemen, I wish to make the following observations and recommendations. One is that the AU is still work in progress. Our union, any other continental or supranational political and economic entity, is continuously evolving. Our messaging should, most of the time, emphasize the progress being made rather than focusing merely on the challenges, as is the ethos of His Excellency President Ruto. Highlighting and emphasizing the ongoing progresses strengthens the confidence in AU's future and encourages member states to remain committed to the collective vision of a stable, peaceful, and prosperous Africa. Second is recognizing strengths in all. Now, APSA's strength lies in diplomacy rather than hard power deterrence. Diplomacy thrives when all parties feel valued. It is therefore essential to focus on the strengths and contributions of each member state rather than on their shortcomings. By doing so, a sense of collective achievement is fostered, where all member states feel like winners in the shared pursuit of continental goals. I believe that this will be a better way to generate some political goodwill, which is very vital in giving the breath of life to APSA. I thank you for your kind attention. Thank you, Solomon.
Thank you very much, Kevin, for highlighting the priority areas identified through the work of the panel that President William Ruto in his report is conveying to his peers, the members of the African Union Assembly, but also the emphasis that is put on the imperative of prioritizing diplomacy rather than hard power as the most vital avenue for making progress as far as addressing peace and security issues are concerned. So as you can see from the ongoing work, there are specific proposals around the merger of APSA and AGA and the establishment of a task force. We have priorities relating to early warning and early action around the African standby force, but also the proposed increment of the endowment of the peace fund from 400 million to 1 billion US dollars. We have also, of course, the proposed strengthening of the African Union normative instruments on unconstitutional change of government, which speaks to the point that Ambassador Andif also made about the current state of things as far as unconstitutional change of government on the continent is concerned. Thank you very much for those remarks. Now, the African Union is indeed a work in progress. I think we all agree with that proposition. And we also depart from the premise that what the African Union needs is not new policy instruments, is not new structures. What it needs is creating the conditions for the effective implementation of existing normative and policy frameworks. That's what we have discussed. I would like now, therefore, to turn attention to Mr. El Ghassim, a member of the reference group on the review of the APSA and former director of peace and security at the AU and former SRSG and head of MINUSMA. And here, what I would like to request is if you kindly share, based on your very rich experience, including in leading various initiatives at the level of the African Union, on what the scope of the APSA review should cover and what a successful review in your mind looks like. So basically, based on your own experience, what should be the things on which we should put premium, we should put emphasis, and how do we get them delivered. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you also or congratulations rather on the initiative. I think it's a timely one. Thank you for inviting me to contribute. I try to build a bit on what Mr. Addis said and a brother from Kenya. And my starting point is, of course, to just to agree with what the panel said about the richness of the AU normative and policy framework. And I'm glad that they reach that conclusion because obviously they could have taken another route of further normative development, further policy development, which in my view would have been a complete misdirection of resources and energy because there is really not much to change in the existing instruments. And I know we all agree on that point, but I just would like to give few examples again, because it's important for people to understand where all this came from. Take, for instance, the issue of unconstitutional changes of governments. I know it has been referred to, and I have seen in a number of policy documents written by think tanks or just academics or experts, people saying, oh, we need stronger norms. But you can't get stronger norms than what you have currently. It's literally, legally speaking, impossible. You take the Malabo Protocol, it places UCGs at the same level as genocide, legally speaking, crime against humanity, war crimes. It can't be stronger than that. It provides for personal accountability for people who are involved in unconstitutional changes. It has provisions on what people often refer to as the civilian coups. Means changing constitutions, removing term limits in ways that do not comply with the constitutional provisions and in contexts that are highly polarized. The Malabo Protocol even adds a sixth category of UCG, so it can be stronger than that. And when you go to the African Charter on Democracy, Elections, and Governance, there are some provisions that are in fact very relevant, including to recent events in Benin. For instance, no member states can host authors of unconstitutional changes. Member states are encouraged to sign extradition agreements so that, if you're involved in a UCG and you run away and try to seek asylum or refuge in a neighboring country, an AU member state, you should be extradited, sent back to your country of origin to stand trial. So it's very strong. And so the issue is not really the norms. The issue is an issue of implementation. Then often when you take conflict situations and you look at the design of the PSC protocol, it was designed precisely to make it impossible for member states to stand on the way of preventive action or mediation efforts. I just take, there are some provisions now. I can't remember the exact article numbers, but I think it should be Article 7 or 8 on procedures. There is something on procedures, which states that no member states can oppose the inclusion of an item on the agenda of the PSC. And it was done on purpose, precisely to avoid situations in which we see a crisis developing and the country concerned opposing the inclusion of that item on the agenda of the PSC. It says, and that is a direct copy of Article 99 of the UN Charter, that the chairperson of the Commission can bring to the attention of the PSC any situation he deems or she deems to be a threat to peace and security in Africa. But the room is there for action. Now, and of course, when it was designed, and Janet could probably provide useful complements, we also understood that even if you give to the PSC extensive powers, it still remains an intergovernmental structure. And therefore, it may not exercise the totality of its powers on account of its composition, because obviously governments make decisions not only based on legal requirements, but also based on constraints on how they perceive their interests at any given point in time. And that's why the panel of the wise in particular was established and given the authority not only to support the chairperson and the PSC, but also to act at its own initiative and to pronounce itself on any situation it deems of relevance to peace and security. And the idea was that the panel, when the PSC or the chairperson of the commission or the commission in general cannot act because of political constraints, the panel would be able to act. That is also the rationale behind the inclusion of the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, Pan-African Parliament into the overall architecture of the PSC, where it will, those organs, especially the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, can bring to the attention of the PSC any situation linked to violations of human rights, which in their view could threaten peace and security, because obviously one early indicator of a conflict in any given situation is widespread violations of human rights. So we have the tools. And I could go on and list a number of other instruments. And I often, when I have discussions with friends, I just say, give me any situation, I challenge you, give me a single situation which cannot be addressed in the context of the existing tools. And I will find a provision that precisely addresses that situation. So the issue are not tools, and I'm happy to note that the panel has made that point, because it will save us a lot of time and resources. Now, the challenge Solomon, we all said, and you repeated it, is of course implementation. Now, implementation depends on two parameters. One of you see, we often refer to the issue of political will. Member states have to demonstrate political will. I completely agree. And let's be frank, I'm not sure we are, in terms of political will, we are in the highest moment of the AU. Have been following AU affairs, OU affairs, in fact, since 1990. And I joined the OU in 1994, and I worked there for 23 years. I think I have hardly ever seen, I would say, a situation where at least, member states' commitment seem to be as weak as it is today. That's an issue. But we should also keep in mind that political will never drop from the sky. It has to be created. Even in those early days of the AU, in the early 2000s, when really we saw a strong level of commitment and engagement, political will was not always the given. It had to be generated, and it has to be generated through creative initiatives, through proactiveness, through continuous research for entry points. And here the Commission has a role to play. There are a variety of ways through which it can leverage AU instruments precisely to trigger the political will. It won't be sufficient, but I still believe there is room for action here. And probably one of the issues, if we want the reform, the recommendations being made to move forward, is to explore how, building on past experiences, because there are past experiences on which the Commission could build to see, how it could strategically leverage existing instruments and the room for maneuver provided to it by the PSC protocol to precisely push member states to take action on some of the situations that it is dealing with. Two last points before I conclude. One, just relate, because often when we speak about instability in Africa, we make a reference to governance, and rightly so. In fact, when you look at the PSC protocol, literally the focus is on prevention and particularly on structural prevention through improved governance, respect for human rights, and so on. When you look at the PSC protocol, the principles, the objectives, and so on. And in fact, the PSC protocol, the PSC is mandated to follow the democratization processes, respect for human rights. I think it's Article 7Q, if my memory, or M, I can't remember now, of the PSC protocol. But the head of states went even further. In 2010, in February 2010, they requested the chairperson of the commission to appoint an independent rapporteur to provide a yearly update on the status of democratization, respect for human rights, and humanitarian law, to enable the PSC protocol to exercise the powers entrusted to it. And I believe maybe we should revisit it, of course, revisit it now in the context of the role and responsibility of the APRM, which produces an annual report on governance, but there are ways of leveraging that instrument. My last point, just going quickly through the report of the panel. There are a number of committees to be established and studies to be undertaken. It's fine, but two words of caution. One, we should never forget we're dealing with political issues. And you will never get an instrument, a legal instrument that is, or SOP, standard operating procedure, that would be as precise, as detailed, as they address, every situation you will be dealing with. That will not exist. I think I read somewhere that they intend to come up with details on how to operationalize Article 16 of the PSC protocol, but that has already been taken care of by the Memorandum of Understanding, which was signed in January 2008. And that memorandum was the result of extensive work between the REX and the AU Commission. And I can tell you, you'll not be able to go any further because obviously the way REX and AU react to particular situation would depend on what is obtaining at the time of decision. So we should really be cautious not to chase the perfect, because the perfect does not exist in this area. We need some level of flexibility. My second point is, as we engage in all this work, these committees and the reports to be produced, we should not lose sight that there are so many serious conflicts that are ongoing in Africa. Sudan, just nearby, the Sahel, lakes. And my worry has always been, as a former staff, but even now, today, with some distance, is that all that work often is done at the expense of the actual mitigation work, prevention work that need to be undertaken on the ground. I see often, I know, it happened, in fact, even during our time, we organized so many workshops on mitigation, prevention, but my point has always been, but go and mitigate what is ongoing already. Go and prevent. We're wasting our time in workshops in hotels, and we're not dealing with the real issues because the Sudanese who are dying really, don't care much about, workshops on mediations. What they want is actual mediation on the ground. So I really would like to see...
If I may press you on that.
Yeah.
If the review or the success of the review is to be tested based on how it would make the AU more effective in addressing these conflict situations that you made reference to, such as Sudan. So how do you see that playing itself out? So what would a successful review would look like if it is applied in the situation in Sudan, for example?
Well, I don't know if it is the role of the review itself, but the review could just say, when you look at the situation in Sudan, I see no aspect that cannot be dealt with existing instruments. I think that's the starting point. When I take the violations against civilians, we have and you know it much better than I do, very extensive human rights instruments that could deal with it. We have experience based on the past, which could be leveraged. In the case of South Sudan in 2013, one action was to put in place a commission for inquiry, an investigation commission, which was led by former President Obasanjo. And I think it's one of the most extensive documentation of the violations that took place in Sudan, which then could be leveraged politically. Can we repeat it today in today's Sudan, given the scale of violations against civilians? I'm just thinking aloud. I go look at the protocol, look at the situation in Sudan, and we look at the provisions of Article 4, it's 4H or G, the one on crimes against humanity, 4H. We have reached the threshold, clearly. Why shouldn't the PAC declare formally that we have reached the threshold of Article 4H? Now, does it mean that it would trigger an intervention per se? Of course, the reality is that we can't. But if you make that determination, it means that for the AU, Sudan can no longer be dealt with as business as usual. So I could go on and identify a number of other practical steps that could be taken. I don't know, that could be leveraged based on past experiences to deal with the situation in Sudan. But my broader point is that, yes, let's put in place all these working groups, let's undertake studies, let's try to perfect what can be perfected, but let's not forget, for the people dying on the ground, none of this makes really a difference. What makes a difference is concrete action that stops the violence. Thank you.
Thank you very much. As we do the review with various proposals that would require further work through various committees and task force. So the push and the call to action is basically that we have to remember that the house is burning and action is not required, not tomorrow, the day after tomorrow, next month or next year. Action is required yesterday. Action is required today. And there are ways of getting those things done. Thank you very much again. Let me now turn to His Excellency Ambassador Said Djinnit, former Commissioner for Peace and Security at the African Union Commission, who actually laid the transition from the Organization of African Unity to the African Union and set the stage and the tone for the operationalization of the Peace and Security Council of the African Union and for taking off the ground of the African peace and security architecture. Your Excellency Ambassador Said Djinnit, thank you very much for making time and for joining us today. And we will very much appreciate your reflections from various experiences that you have on the African continent, both within the AU and the UN, what your reflections are in terms of how this review process can advance the leadership role of the African Union in advancing peace and security. Reference have been made already that we are in a very dire situation at the moment. The level of commitment of member states is at its weakest. But most importantly, as a result of that, the African Union is losing the space for being on the driving seat in responding to peace and security issues as other actors are actually taking over the space. Ambassador, thank you very much once again. You have the floor.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for organizing this dialogue, which is, of course, very, very important at this point in time. Building on the legacy of the OAU, the African Union has, over the years, made sustained efforts to address conflict situations across the continent through its peace, security, and governance architecture centered on the Peace and Security Council. While important achievements have been made, the reality is that peace in many parts of Africa remains elusive. We just spoke of the urgency in Sudan and the current situation in the Great Lakes region. I therefore welcome the initiative to review the African peace, security, and governance architecture currently under review with a view to re-energizing the AU's role in conflict prevention and resolution. This is much welcomed. For the sake of time, I wish to focus on a few key points and allow me to speak frankly. I think one has started to be frank. I will continue in the same tone. First, when the African peace, security, and governance agenda was conceived, it was based on a strong political commitment by member states to shared values and norms, as well as on their readiness to cooperate in the implementation. This commitment was clearly demonstrated in the early years of the African Union. Unfortunately, we have seen gradually that it has gradually faded out and could not be sustained. This declining commitment is reflected in the limited participation of leaders in AU meetings, particularly the summits, and more importantly, in the insufficient cooperation of member states in responding to early warning signals and engaging in preventive diplomacy. On a number of occasions, member states have not cooperated with the AU when it wanted to intervene as early as possible to prevent a conflict from occurring. There are examples for that. If the EU is to enhance its effectiveness, this issue must be addressed as a matter of priority. The commitment of member states and the commitment of all members to cooperate with the EU in its efforts to search for peace. Related to this is the way the AU summits are organized. Summits agenda often leave little space to frank and strategic exchanges among leaders on both progress achieved and shortcomings encountered. In my view, the AU summits should focus on a limited number of important and strategic issues, with other matters handled at ministerial level. We should also revive the practice introduced in the past of reducing lengthy opening ceremonies in order to create more time for substantive, closed-door, eye-to-eye discussions among heads of state in smaller caucus rooms rather than in large plenary halls where leaders are often solicited for bilateral meetings. I was always surprised when I attended AU summits that the opening ceremony took that long and that there were nice sessions because of problem of organization of work and the too much time to ceremonies and little time to real work. Second, the transformation of the Secretariat into a commission was intended to strengthen its capacity to act as the guardian of agreed values and norms, ensure follow-up, and implement decisions through mobilizing and galvanizing member states. Over time, however, this expected role could not be sustained again. Yet, the Peace, Security, and the PSC protocol clearly provides that the powers of the PSC are exercised in conjunction with the chairperson of the Commission. This is to emphasize the fact that the chairperson Commission has a role, significant role to play in peace and security, and recognized role by the PSC protocol. In this context, the role of the chairperson, particularly the power of initiative and proposal, needs to be more clearly defined. Clarifying respective roles would help avoid misunderstandings and enhance accountability on who is doing what. Third, the effectiveness of the Peace and Security Council itself has eroded over the years. This is due in part to the declining commitment, which I have already mentioned, but also to changes in the way the PSC membership is selected. The shift from election based on a clear criteria, which was as provided in the protocol and the initial documents of the AU, to a largely rotational approach has weakened the authority of the Council and in many ways returned us to the shortcomings that existed under the former central organ, where the central organ members were elected on a rotational basis. Fourth, let me say a word about the panel of the wise. When it was created, and I can say this with some authority because I was really deeply and personally involved in its establishment, the panel was envisaged as a strong preventive mechanism, able to act independently and in support of the PSC. The protocol clearly provided for such a role. It was expected to speak openly and forcefully on issues that many of us, including members of the PSC, often addressed only quietly. In reality, it was never able to fully take off from the beginning. Fifth, on constitutional changes of government, both the AU and the regional economic communities have lost credibility. This is due not only to inconsistent responses to coups, but also to the failure to address serious governance issues, notably constitutional manipulation to retain power and democratic backsliding that in some cases have led to coup d'etat. In this context, prospective coup makers increasingly act without fear at a time when democratic commitment are weakening and authoritarian tendencies are growing across the continent. Finally, while the Peace and Security Council is expected to remain the primary continental body responsible for peace and security, it necessarily relies on cooperation with the United Nations and other international partners. Such cooperation should support and not compete with African-led efforts. Competing initiatives and external interferences, which have increased significantly in recent years as a result of geostrategic shifts and weakened African commitment, have often complicated conflicts and delayed their resolution. Strengthening African leadership, therefore, requires a more assertive Peace and Security Council, but it also requires the cooperation of African parties to conflict themselves, which too often engage in forum shopping. In conclusion, this review offers an opportunity not just to adjust structures, but to restore political commitment, clarify roles, and reaffirm African leadership in peace, security, and governance. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Janet, for those very powerful and very well-grounded perspectives, particularly the 5 points that you have outlined, highlighting where the focus for a more effective functioning of the African peace and security architecture needs to lie on, including in terms of adapting it to the realities of the current moment, in terms of both responding to the change continentally and globally, but also to the governance dynamics on the continent. And I think your point clearly speaks to many of the challenges that the continent is facing in the realm of unconstitutional change of government, the fact that military leaders engage in the perpetration of coups without fear of consequences is indicative of the loss of credibility on the part of continental and regional organizations, particularly as it relates to their effective response to governance deficits and the regression of democratic governance, the manipulation of constitutions, as you rightly pointed out. If the AU and the REX do not speak and forcefully respond to those cases of constitutional manipulations, those cases of rigging of elections, those cases of basically making opposition politics impossible, then they shouldn't be surprised if a coup d'etat is landing on their hands. Thank you very much, Your Excellency. And we look forward to engage further on those excellent points that you have made. I now would like to call on Ms. Orit Ibrahim, who is the coordinator of the Situation Room at the African Union Commission, to provide us with a strategic a review and a presentation on the strategic review of the continental early warning system in the context of changing conflict dynamics and institutional reform of the African Union. Orit, thank you very much for joining us. I know you are busy where you are, but we very much appreciate and value your engagement, but also in profiling the ongoing effort to foreground the role and effectiveness of the continental early warning system. Over to you, please.
Thank you very much, Dr. Solomon, for the invitation and for the opportunity to contribute to this distinguished panel of experts. Allow me to begin by saying that speaking after such esteemed excellencies and my former senior bosses, under whom I had a privilege to work and learn, makes this intervention both humbling and challenging. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, Your Excellencies, honorable officials, distinguished participants. My name is Orit Ibrahim. I'm the coordinator of Situation Room within the APSA department. Excellencies and distinguished participants, I'll be brief and focused. I'll begin by recalling the mandate and purpose of the Continental Early Warning System, explain the rationale for its strategic review, and highlight how the review seeks to close the early warning, early action gap while strengthening prevention in line with the broader high-level APSA and AGA reform. As you are all aware, the Continental Early Warning System was established under Article 12 of the Protocol relating to the establishment of Peace and Security Council to operationalize the African Union's conflict prevention mandate, specifically to facilitate the anticipation and prevention of conflicts. The protocol defines a Continental Early Warning System as a continent system composed of a situation room at the AU Commission and regional observations and monitoring centers directly linked to the continental situation room. This design was deliberate. It anchored the Continental Early Warning System as a continent-wide early warning system, while recognizing the indispensable role of the regional economic communities and regional mechanisms in generating context-specific analysis and information. From the outset, QS was therefore conceived not as a standalone technical function, but as a strategic prevention instrument intended to inform political decision-making by the Peace and Security Council and to support timely prevention action. It is for this reason that the Continental Early Warning System strategic review is directly linked to the ongoing high-level review of the African peace and security architecture and African governance architecture. As the Continental Early Warning System, which we call in short QS, constitutes one of the central pillars of APSA and underpins the Union's conflict prevention effort, as I mentioned earlier. Excellencies, early warning is not an end in itself. It is the analytical and anticipatory foundation of prevention across both frameworks. APSA provides the instrument for preventive diplomacy, mediation, and response, while AGA addresses the structural and governance-related drivers of conflict. QS sits at the intersection of these two architectures by generating risk analysis that should inform both immediate political action and long-term structural prevention. Therefore, reviewing QS in isolation would therefore be insufficient. The review necessarily examines whether early warning analysis can be effectively feed coordinated preventive action across APSA and AGA. Against this background, the Continental Early Warning System Strategic Review, which was held last month in Kigali, must be understood as a 20-year institutional stock-taking mandated by the Peace and Security Council. Specifically, the PSC Communique 1251 explicitly requested the AU Commission to expeditiously undertake a comprehensive review of queues. This was not a technical audit. It was a strategic self-assessment aimed at answering a fundamental question of, after nearly 2 decades, are queues, institutional arrangements, methodologies, and decision support still fit for purpose, particularly in light of evolving conflict dynamics and the diffusion of responsibilities following recent AU institutional reform. The timing of the review is also critical because Africa's peace and security landscape has fundamentally evolved. This evolution is clearly captured in PSC Communique 1233, where the Council expressed deep concern about new and emerging threats that multidimensional and interconnected, ranging from terrorism and violent extremism to climate insecurity, cyber threats, and complex socio-economic shocks. While the Continental Early Warning System has expanded its data collection to reflect these risks, the review identified a key limitations, which is the absence of a formalized triggering mechanisms that systematically translate warning into timely preventive action. In this context, the review also examines queues' role in structural prevention using the Continental Structural Conflict Prevention Framework, including its 2 tools, Country Structural Vulnerability and Resilience Assessment, and its mitigation strategy. These instruments are critical because they allow Continental Early Warning System to move beyond monitoring proximate triggers and analyze deep-rooted structural drivers of conflict. Strengthening this structural lens is essential in closing the early action gap by addressing root causes, not only symptoms. To respond to this challenge, the strategic review advances a set of interlinked reforms. It underscores the need for technological modernization, including the use of artificial intelligence and big data analytics to enhance Continental Early Warning System's capacity to process large volume of open source information, social media content, and geospatialized data. This aligns again with PSC Communique 1214, which calls on the AU Commission to promote technology-driven early warning system capable of detecting emerging risk earlier and more accurately. The review also highlights the need for institutional clarity and leadership. The current configuration where early warning analysts have been distributed across regional desks have diluted Continental Early Warning System operational coherence. Beyond system and structure, the review recognized that the conversion of warning into action is often impeded by political hesitation. The Peace and Security Council itself has acknowledged this challenge. PSC Communique 1251 notes with concern, in quotes, the persistent culture of denialism by some member states regarding credible early warning reports. The review therefore recommends clearer criteria-based triggers to reduce ambiguity and support more consistent and timely preventive responses. The review further re-examines AU-REX coordination, which is foundational to Continental Early Warning System design. Article 12 of the PSC protocol, specifically 12.2b, define queues as a system in which regional observation and monitoring units are directly linked to the AU Situation Room, making REX an integral pillar of the Continental Early Warning architecture. However, despite this mandate and existing frameworks such as the 2008 MOU between the regional economic communities and the African Union Commission, specifically with the Continental Early Warning System, the review found that operational coordination has weakened in recent years. And in conclusion, the Q strategic review is a PSC-driven reform process that directly contributes to strengthening APSA and AGA prevention functions. By restoring institutional coherence, modernizing analytical methodologies, reinforcing AU-REX coordination, and addressing political challenge to early action, the review lays a foundation for what can be considered next generation of Continental Early Warning System, or QS 2.0. A more integrated, technologically enabled, politically responsive early warning system. Ultimately, such a system is a strategic imperative for closing a long-standing early warning, early action gap and ensures that APSA reform delivers tangible preventive impact on the ground. We also look forward to the presentation and consideration of the high-level APSA and AGA review, championed by His Excellency President William Ruto at the African Union Summit in February as a key step toward reinforcing our continental prevention framework. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Orit, for providing us with an overview of the strategic review of the Continental Early Warning System, including providing us the background to and the importance of this review of the Continental Early Warning System, how the Continental Early Warning System or the review of the Continental Early Warning System could contribute to bridging the gap between early warning and early action and advance preventive measures by the African Union. And the link between this Continental Early Warning System review and that of the overall APSA-AGA review. I will quickly move to Dr. Paul Simon Handy, Regional Director of the Institute for Security Studies. You heard the presentations, including the proposals from the panel and the champion of the institutional reform. Recently, you wrote a very informative and insightful piece where you actually were calling for an alignment between the reform process and Africa's ambitious agenda. You identified one area which speaks to one of the proposed recommendations of the panel and the champion, which is the merger of AGA and APSA. In your piece, you made a very compelling point to say that perhaps we have to pause and think about whether or not the merger of the political affairs department with peace and security department was actually the right decision to make. Earlier on, I had the opportunity to have on our podcast, the Pan-Africanist, Her Excellency Hannah Tete. And in one of our reflections, she indeed made that observation that perhaps we need to really prioritize and give time of place for political affairs, given the democratic backslide that Ambassador Janet made reference to, given the unconstitutional change of government that we are experiencing. So, Paul, I'm putting you on the spot, I know, but it's always good to problematize based on, because there is already an experience. The peace and security work seems to have overshadowed what should have been front and center, which is politics and diplomacy. Over to you, Paul. And thank you very much for honoring our invitation, please.
Thank you very much, Solomon. Thanks for organizing this conversation, really timely, and also, thanks to all the interesting inputs that have been made. I have the privilege of speaking as the last one, so I can reflect on what has been said, and that's exactly what I'm going to do. And I would like to focus on 3 points. First, the vision. I mean, what is this reform trying to achieve, actually? the expected outcome. And the second point will be the mantra of political will. We hear a lot about how political will is missing, how the frameworks are great, but it's the political will that is missing. Maybe the frameworks are not that great, because if they were great, then they will generate political will. So, but I'll come back to it. And the last point is about the roles that need to be clarified within APSA. Namely the PSC. Ambassador Jinit had already raised that issue, the PSC, the chairperson, and the political affairs department. So let me start with a question. We saw the recent wave of coup. Would we say that if we had merged AGA and APSA, would it have prevented this wave of coup? I would like to doubt. The good thing with the reform process now is that we have 20 years to reflect on what has been done. And we can draw lessons. And particularly in the last 4 years, when I look at the merger of political affairs and peace and security commissions, one of the fears we had actually at the beginning was that political affairs will actually be the loser. The loser in terms of attention devoted to it, the loser in terms of a number of staff, the loser in terms of budget. And if you look at what's happening now, actually, you take one division within the Conflict Management Directorate, it's much bigger, twice as big as the whole direction for the former political affairs direction. So it says a lot. And let's be completely honest, I'll come back to it. Member states do not like governance issues. They do not like the AU to deal with governance issues. I mean, what Orit was saying just now, that member states are in denial of early warning reports. Yes, it's a manifestation of the fact that member states do not want the AU Commission to mingle into the internal affairs. Now, political will. The real question is, why is political will so low? And particularly, why now? Because there was a time, actually, where we thought coup d'etat were history in Africa. Why? Because there was commitment by the leadership, particularly by what we generally refer to as Africa's hegemons, the big countries who, as Minister Addis was saying, were taking more responsibility to drive, at least at the regional level, the African peace and security architecture's agenda. Those hegemons have been recently a bit in some sort of retreat because they are more focused with the internal affairs than interested with what's happening in the direct neighborhood and beyond. But I'm wondering if the very intergovernmental nature of the AU is not part of the problem. And maybe an intergovernmental organization does not necessarily have what it takes to implement what happens to be a supranational agenda, actually. The AU is a very strong organization in terms of the type of frameworks it has been able to generate, but the commitment is low because it's not binding, generally. Of course, you do not want to force, to coerce member states into applying rules. Maybe they agreed to generate, but whose implementation they don't feel is a necessity. The question is why. You know, African member states don't qualify to get into the AU. They are members of the AU by virtue of geography. So you don't have to make an effort to get into the AU. You're just there. As soon as you become independent, you are a member of the AU. And the criteria of good behaviors are actually reverse engineered. It's not before entering the AU, it's actually after. We tried with the suspension regime after coup to create some sense of collective agreement about good behavior. But the suspension regime, the post-coup suspension regime, was actually never meant to have up to 7 countries suspended. That's just not, it actually completely disorganizes the way the AU operates. So as much as I think the suspension regime is critical, it's important, and the AU has to stick to it, the real problem, and we've talked about it in several ways today, is actually how do we prevent coup? Naming and shaming coup leaders doesn't deter them anymore. There was a time it was, but it doesn't work anymore because we're living in a global context in which democracies are actually, purely statistically, there are more autocracies today than democracies. So democracies are actually in a sort of retreat. So it is a global context that has a major influence on what's happening in Africa as well. But so the question of the prevention is intricate. Is linked to the question of governance. The real question maybe should be, how can the AU help member states to improve their governance? And there's no easy answer to that question. Now the third point about clarifying the roles of certain organs. The Peace and Security Council, first one, is moving towards a next election. And over the weekend, I was actually reading the PSC protocol and was looking at the criteria for membership into the PSC. First thing is that there are a list of criteria, but they are not legally binding. They're aspirational. Let me take one uncomfortable example. The PSC should be made of countries that do not only take critical decisions on peace and security matters, but should be able to implement them. And to implement them, we need a certain number of issues that are actually mentioned in the protocol, but that are often disregarded by member states. So that's why the PSC can take decisions without actually any pressure to implement them, and creating the issue that analysts, not just analysts, even PSC members themselves, have been raising, that we have, and in fact, the former chairperson of the commission even put a number into it, like 2% of decisions of the PSC that are not implemented. So, but also the role of the chairperson, as Ambassador Ginit was alluding to, maybe needs to be clarified as well. It's very clear, but we see that personalities also matter. Personalities engage into their role in different ways, some going beyond what is prescribed, others not exhausting the possibilities that are enshrined in the charter and the protocol establishing the PSC. Regarding political affairs, I'm skeptical. I was one of those who was never convinced about I don't think the African governance architecture was necessary because the PSC protocol was actually catering for governance issues. So for me, nice to have maybe, but the PSC protocol was enough to cater for governance matters. It was a comprehensive protocol that didn't need the addition of a governance architecture. But having said that, and afterwards we had the APRM, there are enough instruments actually to deal with governance issues, but this is clearly the biggest obstacle is that member states do not want the AU Commission to mingle into the governance matters. And they can block it in different ways, which they also use. And to finish, I will say that, yeah, the merger of AGA and APSA was maybe overdue, but the danger is that it might further weaken the importance that should be allocated to governance matters that happen to be the real problem. And I'll end with a question that we maybe collectively should answer, is about whether or not for every member state of the African Union, there is, and it's a question that was raised by many people already, if there is a clear sense of the interest, or let me put it a different way, is there a clear understanding by every member state that they are better off within the AU than outside? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Paul Simon, for your interventions. I think in terms of clarifying certain points, the one point that I thought is worth mentioning is the point about whether something is binding or not. So if it is a treaty, then out of necessity it is binding. Whether member states follow through is a different matter. It has nothing to do with the fact that it is, so what is stated in the PSC protocol is clearly binding because of the fact that it is a binding legal instrument. But the follow through, as you rightly pointed out, is where I think much of the focus needs to be placed on. I would now open the floor for questions and answers. I have recognized already that Ambassador Jinnit would like to say a few things on the merger of political affairs, peace and security, and the proposed merger of governance and peace and security as well. I'll come to you, Ambassador. I see that the Ambassador of Sudan have raised a hand, so please, can you give a mic to Ambassador of Sudan?
Shukran jazilan. Thank you, Dr. Solomon, for inviting us to this very important panel. I'm bringing a panelist of experience, people who have been active in this area of the reform according to their background. And I would like to just to shed the light on a certain angle of what had been discussed. From the beginning, first panelist, Nadif, indicated a very important remark that the reform is a continuous process because even the normative frameworks, the charters, the protocols that had been adopted by the AU are adopted by compromise to some extent. And when something adopted by compromise, it needs always to be reformed. So the reform is and should be a continuous process that coping with generations, because problems of today are not problems of yesterday. Even at the international level today, with the social media, with the mondialization, things are changing a lot. What I want to ask about is that is the reform is a process that look to the African state from outside, or it should accompany looking from inside what is going on inside the states? And because most of the panelists indicates and put the accent on some cases of what is called the unconstitutional changes, problems of countries in transition, and that means problems of democracy and democratizations. And I think that democracy is a process. It is not an end in itself. That means the African state is a newborn state. Some countries are still now celebrating their 50th anniversary of independence. That the African country, inside each African countries, there are complexities. So unless the reform accompany those states in reforming that democratization and to look inside the countries to see the real African problems, which problems that they suffer from, we cannot reach to a reform if the reform come from outside to inside the states. And if I can take the example of the Charter for Democracy and Elections and the suspension that had been taken by the AU vis-a-vis some countries, and the example of my country, Sudan, is there, had been indicated, for example, suspending the African Union sanctions the countries, in fact, and sanctions even the people by suspending them for a long period of time, for even years. And this is what gives the room for the external manipulation. Too many hands entered while the African initiative is away. And that is the case in Sudan today, or may be applied to other countries. And I would like to really shake hands with those who speak about the early warning system, the preventive diplomacy, and accompanying countries in the process of reforming and implementing the ideas. Now the PSCC, I give you the direct example. Tomorrow there will be a session of the PSCC concerning my country. The country is absent. What is the new added value that can be added if you eliminate not to hear to the people of a certain country? And if we believe that democracy is existing in countries that are not in transition, you will deceive yourself, because if you look to the inside of many, many African countries, they need a help in that regard. And that is my point. And the APSA, the AGA, the reform should put into consideration the external factor, which is very, very played a very good, and the non-state actors, many things. So I would like to say that the AU, the reform should accompany the countries in proceeding to arrive to democratization, not to suspend them and eliminating them. And there, the AU should build on something. It is not in the vacuum. On those countries, there are governments who are there. They didn't reach the stage of democratization, but they need to be accompanied, not to be eliminated. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Any other question? Okay, I see a hand at the back and the lady here. Yes, I recognize you.
Good morning. Thank you so much, Aman Africa, Mr. Solomon, for hosting us and convening such important discussion. My name is Baruch Aschalo. I work as Executive Director for the Africa Youth Forum, which is a young leaders platform for Pan-African discussion. My question goes as follows. What must be the African uses, or how their contribution of young African leaders can play a role and make a difference in APSA and reform we are looking for? Because when we see from history, users in different parts of the world, Europe, US, Asia, contribute meaningfully in terms of bringing reform and development in a state or continent that they aim for. So it's just a very short, simple question from all of you to get the reflection. What must be the role of young African leaders? What must be African youth play in terms of the reform we're looking? Because any movement in work, not including young leaders, users, cannot be achieved, since, as we know, Africa is the youngest continent, at the same time, a population with a larger number of users. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very important question. Yes, madam, please.
Thank you so much. My name is Judith Musa, and I would like to, first of all, make a statement and then ask a question.
You are from?
I am from the Institute for Peace and Security Studies.
Thank you.
In reiteration of the statement made by the ambassador of Sudan, it's very important that we look at African issues from the country level and what is happening inside the country. And this brings me to also reiterate the statement that has been made from the African Youth Forum about inclusion, where in most cases we have this conflicts and civil wars affecting local communities, who some of them may not even understand what exactly is happening, but they are suffering, yet they are trusting these countries to protect and take care of them. But then now to my question, how are these reforms considering Africa's position in the global community? Because we have the African Union's theme of 2025 as reparations for Africans and the people of African descent. And at some point, I was looking for a document that would actually highlight all these injustices for reparations and reparative and restorative justices. And looking at it, when it comes to the colonial injustices, somehow they are not mentioned. And in most of the searches, they say that the discussion has started at the continental level in 2025, or let's say in the recent years. So what is the role of, how is the role of Africa in the global community influencing these reforms that we are talking about in the peace and security architecture in the continent? Thank you.
Thank you very much. So the question of Africa's role and positioning in the global arena and how this review actually speaks to that. I think in some ways, the point that the ambassador of Sudan also made about the role of external actors also relates to this point. Yes, David, please.
Good morning, and thank you, Amani Africa, for inviting us. My name is David Johannes. I'm from the Institute for Security Studies. I'll depart from what the panel has mentioned in terms of the uniqueness of the current moment, which is an existential moment of soul searching. So I'd like to ask the panelists if this feeling of existential moment of soul searching is felt by member states. And secondly, beyond the role of the champion, which is very critical, what needs to be done differently to take this conversation to the various capitals, because the crux of the matter of all these review processes ultimately relies on how member states are going to implement this. Thank you very much.
Excellent. I mean, this obviously speaks to the point about the need for advancing buy-in by member states of the agenda, and that it cannot just be that of the role of champion only bearing the responsibility for advancing this reform agenda. I think there is a political question there, so I'm sure members of the panel will come. On whether or not member states are feeling this moment, that's a great question, really. Yes, please, Topiwa from Embassy of Zimbabwe.
Thank you very much, Dr. Solomon, for giving me the floor. And thank you panelists for unpacking this discussion. I would want to reflect on two issues by first noting that definitely the review of APSA is very important given the challenges of peace and security that we continue to face in Africa. However, as a country and in my personal capacity, I would think that we need to reflect on two issues. The issue of implementation and funding. Firstly, on implementation, there's been a review that was done by the African Union, and there was an indication that less than 16% of the AU decisions are implemented. Secondly, regarding funding, over 80%, maybe 70% of the AU budget is from partners, and over 95% of peace and security programs is from partners. Now, if we want to review APSA and we can't implement what we already have, is there any need to review it? Aren't we just going in circles where even if we review and we can't implement? Secondly, the issue of funding that I spoke about. We always say there's no fund to carry out the programs. Now, if there is no funding, how are we going to implement the programs? Secondly, we have external partners whom we expect to be helping us. Yet on the other hand, we accuse them of external interference in our programs. How do we go about these two issues, the issue of implementation and the issue of funding? Thank you.
Thank you very much for further complicating our lives. Yes, John, please.
Good morning. My name is John. I'm from the Canadian Mission to the African Union. Thank you, Dr. Solomon. It's always a pleasure to interact with you and have this opportunity to be here. My question will be very quick, but it will complement what we've already heard from some of our colleagues. It's going to be specific to His Excellency, Mr. Wan, who intrigued me very much by a comment he made, but didn't further elaborate on. And it's specifically about this question of political will that is a perpetual one here, and one that others, including Dr. Handy, have ruminated on. So Mr. Wan mentioned specifically that the AU needs to think about how to trigger political will. And he elaborated and said, build on past experiences to strategically leverage existing instruments to mobilize member states in different ways. So I'd be fascinated to hear a little bit more about that as we seek to overcome the perpetual challenge of political will.
Thank you very much. So let me come to the members of the panel, and then we will have another round. As we come back to the members of the panel, I think this point also relates to the point that Ambassador Janit made about the role of the African Union Commission as well. So let me give the floor first to Ambassador Janit, who would also comment on the question of the merger. Ambassador Janit.
Thank you. Yeah, I wanted to say something about the merger of the two departments because I had the strong views on. Is it okay? Are you hearing me, please?
Loud and clear.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, I said because I had some reservation about the merger of the two departments that happened some years ago. I was honestly surprised that it was done without any deep consultation on the background of the two departments. That's why, you know, I always say, and I made it again today, about the lack of institutional memory. The problem of our institutions, both national and regional and continental, is that whenever somebody comes, we get the impression that we are starting all over again and starting from scratch and from zero, as if nothing has happened before, both in terms of commitment and whatever has prevailed before. People should have known that the two departments were actually merged before. And the OAU, the two departments were under the same department. Under the OAU, there was a Department of Political Affairs, which included peace and security and governance. And there was the last Assistant Secretary General for Political Affairs. And during the transition, I was the commissioner, the interim commissioner for peace, security, and political affairs. So I know what it's about. We came to the conclusion, when we went to the African Union, I personally came to the conclusion that you cannot keep the two departments together for a number of reasons. One, you cannot, as interim commissioner for peace, security, and political affairs, I had enough to do with peace and security, and they had enough on the one hand to do with governance. And governance both needed to be unpacked to develop the architecture. That's why we have seen that the APSA was more developed than the AGA, because precisely there was not enough efforts on the political affairs department. That's why we suggested that the two departments be separated so that we have enough time and energy to deal with urgent peace and security issues on the continent, and have spare enough time for somebody else to deal with issue governance which have to be developed in the continent. So I want to tell you just a story to tell you how this issue was taken. When we established the African Union and separated the two portfolio, I personally went to the implementation committee of NEPAD, composed of how many members of the AU at that time, 12 or more, and key important member states of NEPAD in Abuja. And I suggested that we should create a Department of Peace and Security on the one hand, and a Department of Democracy, Governance, and Humanitarian Affairs, something like that, governance and democracy. You know, I got the strongest support from the leaders in Abuja, to the extent that President Obasanjo himself, who was chairing the meeting, proposed that that portfolio be enhanced to the level of High Commissioner for democracy, governance, and humanitarian affairs. I had to plead with him and other members too, other heads of state, that we should keep the harmony among the portfolios, and we kept it at the level of commissioner. But when it came to the reform of 2003, that started from the ambassador's level to the ministers, but especially at ambassador's level, that was totally ignored. And because they didn't want, and somebody has referred that earlier, they didn't want to have a portfolio that refers implicitly to governance, democracy, election, or they put it in the envelope of political affairs. That led to some confusion between the portfolios, which led maybe others after that to say it makes sense to merge them. But actually, there was a merit for the two portfolios to remain together. Since I have the floor, I want to briefly just react to some of the questions, and in particular that of our brother from Sudan on the suspension of member states. I mean, to my sense, the suspension is not complete total isolation of that country. Actually, after a coup d'etat has occurred, the African Union and the Commission is expected to be engaging the country. So there is a period of engagement, close engagement towards early restoration of constitutional order. So there is no cut of relation. To the contrary, they should enhance engagement for the restoration of constitutional order. And the dilemma between the role of external actors when the role of external, we need external actors, but we don't want interference. And when there is financial support of the, of course, Africa should find, and then of course the colleague who spoke about that is right, that we should find resources within the continent. And there have been discussions within the AU, and this needs to be pursued and implemented, because Africa should be consistent with its commitment. It should live up to the commitment by putting the resources to implement its own decisions. But this will not stop the AU from receiving support from abroad, because it will still need support, and that support should not be in contradiction. We had the peace fund with the European Union in the past, which has helped us deal with significant conflict situation in the continent, and we have never perceived that as interference, because they came to support totally African decisions and African leadership. I think a weaker organization makes it more amenable to influence than a stronger organization. When the organization is strong, even external resources can be received and still under the African Union leadership. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Janet. A number of questions have been asked, so let me come to you, members of the panel, if there are specific questions that you'd like to answer. Ambassador Andrif.
Merci beaucoup, docteur. Moi, je voudrais évoquer
For me, I'd like to talk about two subjects that were actually observed through different questions here. First of all, our AU model, knowing that we are not following a process, we are joining a certain number of values before being accepted. And, as independent African countries, we end up just joining. These questions are always asked. We have a benefit, we have inconveniences. I think our story is the main reason. For me, the problem is not on how we join the AU. That is not the issue entirely. For me, I think it is the question related to the leadership. The leadership of our African leaders.
Vous voyez, il y a des pays, moi je connais des pays comme le Mali.
I know countries like Mali, where the Pan-African commitment has reached to a level in 1960s. Where in the constitution of a country like Mali, they are saying that Mali can give everything to the benefit of the African unity. And so this is why I'm really creating this nexus with the issues in Africa. When you are elected to become an African leader, are we sharing these values? Are we ready to share, a part of our sovereignty to benefit Africa? This is what we have to think about. And we always tend to ask this question to the youth. We see the youth being more motivated, but we see also some of the youth, when they get to the power, they do the opposite. And so this is another problem. So for me, I am questioning the question related to leadership. So for those who want to get to the power, are they really sharing the values, Pan-African values, the unity, the commitment? This is what we have to question ourselves, because this is exactly what is supposed to be at the center. That means the political will. The second aspect is related to our commitment. We talk about Pan-Africanism, sovereignty, and we see that daily with our international partners, other international partners, we talk about sovereignty, but we are not ready to really make sure it's fit for purpose. And so these are questions that we cannot have easy answers, theoretical answers. But we really need, especially at the level of our youth, they should really have a civil education that is going to continue. And this is where the role of the civil society has to be in play. Because when you are role, you have to share a lot of values. And when you get there, when it comes to the power, you should really be faithful to your principles, to your values that we actually owe each other. And so here, we are really facing some type of crisis at the level of the AU. And I think we really need work. We need to work. This is why, with the recommendations and institutional reforms, we have emphasized on questioning the commitment of the African leaders on the idea of Pan-Africanism, as that was at the center when we created OAU and AU. So we really need to raise awareness, we need to train, we need to educate people so that this idea of the AU integration becomes our flag that we should defend. We cannot be a member of the AU for the African integration or the African independence without really thinking about the sovereignty. So we want to benefit from advantages or benefits, but when inconvenience happens, we are not ready to take it or to embrace it. And so this is what should really call us. This is what I would like to share with all of you. Thank you.
Excellent. I think the point about the role of member states within the framework of the African Union and how that relates to the implementation of the commitments made within the framework of the African Union. The idea of trying to get implementation through coercion, through sanction, I'm not sure if those tools actually would work in the African context for historical reasons, but also for a number of other reasons. And the lessons from past experience in terms of the transition from the OU to the AU as well are instructive in those terms. That even when some quote-unquote hegemonic countries, were not enthusiastic about and may even be opposing to continental project, it's not that position that was relied upon. It is basically the position of other member states that led to the advancement of certain agendas. Now, there were questions about, specifically to you, Elgasim1, and then Paul, as well as Kevin, on the question of the use, on the question of foreign relations and international relations. Shouldn't the African Union actually and Africa have a position on those matters? More so because of the points that have been made, including the question of how do you deal with external interference of the kind that actually doesn't advance Africa's cause but weakens it, and how do you actually establish and maintain a balanced international relations with all different actors with whom, as provided in the PSC protocol, you need to work together, right? So over to you. Paul, let me start with you. And also the question of use, please.
Thank you. It's a pity that Ambassador of Sudan is not here anymore, but I would like to agree with.
His difficulties here.
Thank you, sir. I would like to agree with the mention he made of the relative youth of African countries. African countries are very young, actually. 60, 65 years in the broader scheme of history is a footnote. So young countries will have teething problems of state building. So in a way, what we are seeing, all these upheavals that we are seeing, including coup d'etat, actually part of state building, that is generally quite a brutal process. State encounter war while building their capacities to manage a territory and to provide public goods. So I'm not saying wars are good, but they just happen when states are being built. So and I think the reform of AGA, APSA should also aim at providing support to African states rather than just pointing fingers and sanctioning. The incentive should come actually to generate these drive to improve governance because it trickles down on many things. I'm sometimes extremely surprised to hear people say external interferences. Every country in the world is subject to external interference. Why do we think in Africa will be exempted from it? It happens everywhere. The US spies on China and vice versa, and everybody interferes in other people's affairs. That is just, for any student of international relations, it happens. Whether it's good, bad, it just happens. So states should just build enough capacity to drive their own affairs by minimizing the effect of external affairs, but they will happen. And complaining about it is a bit naive, actually, because we are wasting time. They will happen, and they will continue to exacerbate or improve developments. But to wish them away is a bit naive. So please, let's get to business. I would like to say a few things about what Ambassador Anadif just said, and I fully agree with the fact that the commitment to whatever people consider Pan-Africanism of African unity is low, and we are observing a lot of elections in Africa, and I've always been surprised by the total absence of any reference to the AU by political parties. Who wins an election by saying that they will be driving African unity? I have not really seen that. So in addition to civil society, I think should also be looking at how political, and there are many issues that can be raised. Regional integration is part of that movement as well. But it is striking to see that despite the omnipresence of Pan-Africanism, particularly in social media, in youth discourse, political parties do not deem it necessary, at least now, to campaign by saying that they will improve any Pan-African movement. It may be a bit striking, but it says a lot about, to come back to the question of my colleague Dawit, bringing back the debate of the reform, but the debate also of African unity back to the member states, to the countries. It doesn't happen enough, and I think this is a big, it is lacking in that regard. The question on youth. Well, the youth of today generally does not necessarily ask to be part of a process, to just come and grab those things. So you guys are Gen Z. You are you generally do not beg. So please do be part of this. Do not ask. I mean, come up with actions, innovations, and you will eventually be considered. But if you ask, these guys will not let you in. Thank you.
As you heard, the reflections sought to problematize some of the proposals that are on the table from the panel and from the champion, including on the question of the merger, in the light of the strategic importance of the governance question, whether it is actually further overshadowing it if we actually insist on this idea of merger. So I think, yeah.
Thank you very much, Dr. Solomon. I want to make reference to a cartoonist in one of the most famous publications on this issue of reform. There was a cartoon, and they say photos speak louder than words. And the cartoonist asked, "Who is in favor of reforms?" It was in a room, and I think everybody said, "Yeah, we're in favor of reforms." Then the cartoonist asks, "Who wants to be reformed?" And no hand went up. And I think that captures this dichotomy. Dr. Solomon will be familiar with the cartoonist. And when Minister Anadif and his his colleagues came to Nairobi to assist the champion in driving the reform process, that's the first question they were asking us. Is there a problem? Do we need to reform the union? And we all agreed. And the question was, what needs to be reformed? What is it that needs to be split up or to be merged, so to speak, to drive the reform process? And what are the challenges to this reform process? And I think three things came up, which I've noted. And one of them was clearly the political will. As has been mentioned by my co-panelist, is that we do have the instruments, we do have the desire to see this ball moving forward, but the political will. And Dr. Paul, you're saying that it's not necessary, but I think there's something there. The political will. The union can only be as good as its member states. If its member states don't want to reform, then it becomes a bit of a challenge to drive the ball forward. The other aspect, the other challenge that we are seeing is that, and reference is being made to the continent being a young continent, but within it, we have member states who are in different levels of advancements, different philosophies, and to try to merge all that. But I think Africa deserves credit. The fact that we are willing to talk about this reform process, in spite of the fact that we are all in different stages of development, different philosophies, different cultures, but we are willing to come together and reform the union. The last thing is about funding, and I think the distinguished representative from Zimbabwe brought it up. Are we willing to fund our own reform process? Are we willing to fund the AU's programs? And now Kenya has been fortunate to chair the budgeting process of the AU. And the one lesson that we learned is that member states, we have an ambition. We are very ambitious on what we want to achieve, but we are having trouble funding it. Members are like, no. Maybe the budget should be capped at this. And again, we are only as good as we're willing to fund the union. Let me conclude by a question that was raised by John from Canada, is how to trigger political will within the leadership of our continent. Now, I may not have a straight answer, but Minister Anadif made reference to Pan-Africanism, the need to bring it back. I'm a bit too young, but in the 60s, I recall the founding fathers and mothers of this continent had one agenda, and I think that was the OAU's raison d'etre, which was to rid the continent of colonization. And I think that galvanized a sense of action. There was clearly political will to achieve that goal. But we have the AU, Agenda 2063, Silencing the Guns, quite a number of programs on board. But is there an overriding agenda or an overriding, I lack the word right now, but it's something that can give the oomph, the kick to galvanize that singular continental drive and therefore generate political will, as it were. Maybe that is a question that should be posed to our leaders, but also to ourselves as members of the continent. Solomon, I don't know whether I've tackled your question well. Yeah. All right. Thank you very much.
To Mr. Wan, is there a tension between suspension and AU's responsibility for deploying robust and effective efforts in countries that are suspended? And also the question, how do you go about triggering political commitment and political will? And the question around funding, you may add on that question, as well as the issues relating to external relations, including the question of external interference and its impact on peace and security on the continent. Thank you. Because that was one of the points that the ambassador of Sudan actually mentioned, where he said it has become one of the factors that is making the resolution of conflict in Sudan also difficult. Thank you.
Let me start with the issue of political will. Obviously, when member states were, I'll say in the early 2000s somehow, building on the momentum generated by the establishment of the AU, the Commission could somehow build on that enthusiasm and push as much as it could. But even then, it does not mean that member states were readily or were just ready to undertake any action. Even then, they had to be pushed. Obviously, we could rely on some head of states, but they had to be pushed. And my point is, the momentum that was generated in the early 2000 weekends, the role of the Commission becomes, in fact, even more important. That's my point. And it becomes more important. And then now here I'm talking about techniques, about technologies to generate action. How do you use the tools at your disposal to generate action? Now, the only thing I can share, because I can only talk about stuff I know, is what I have witnessed or experienced. And I'll give few examples on what could be done. And again, I'm not saying you can replicate it as is, but that's why I was referring to learning from experience. And I think Ginit referred to institutional memory. Unfortunately, it's a big challenge. There is little institutional memory. I have now more time than I had in the past to read and to listen to people. And often I'm always amazed when I listen to people. I say, but have they done their homework to read what exists, to learn from existing experience? And really, I doubt. And here my criticism goes not only to staff members, but also even to some of the academics and some of the think tanks. Sorry, Solomon, not necessarily you as a person, but I just wonder, do people really do their homework to look at what existed? Now, let me give you a few examples. And Ginit can probably support me here because he was involved directly. I learned of it later. In 1990, September 1989, Ahmed Salim took over the General Secretariat of the OAU. And of course, he took over at a time of monumental changes within Africa with demands for reform that preceded, in fact, the end of the Cold War. We often forget it. And also changes with the end of the Cold War, democratization in the East, end of some of the long-running wars on the continent. Now, we could have probably just said, well, events are ongoing and I do what is expected of me, I mean the basics. But he took upon himself, no one requested him to do it, to say, well, I need to submit a report to member states on the fundamental changes taking place in the world and their implications for Africa, along with proposals for action. And he came up with the idea. Kinit and myself have recounted the whole process in a piece we wrote in 2020 on the 1990 declaration, on the 30th anniversary of the 1990 declaration. And he came up with a report, which in actual fact, he took upon himself to tell member states that in February, the budgetary session then used to have two council of ministers, one devoted to budget in February, and the other one to prepare the summit in July. And he said, well, I'm going to add on the agenda of the February budgetary session, February 1990, an item on fundamental changes taking place in the world. And member states came in big numbers, ministers came, and of course, he engineered a request to him to submit a report, which he did in July 1990. And that report generated the 1990 declaration, and most, I would say, 98% of the AU normative and policy framework, you see, in fact, takes its root in that 1990 declaration. It's an example. I'm just saying it's an example one could learn from. Another example, 2015, and I was directly involved, very directly involved. You had a coup in Burkina Faso. There was another coup, but it somehow crowned demonstrations against attempt by then President Compaoré to extend his terms in office. A transition was initiated with the AU and ECOWAS support, and there was another coup in 2015. And we took upon ourselves, I think it was Commissioner Shergi was then commissioner, I was director, Madam Zuma was chairperson, I think at that time. We took upon ourselves to issue a communique, no request, we could have just issued the usual communique to say we condemn, to say that the kidnapping, because this is what it was, of the members of government by the military to take power was an act of terrorism. And we issued a very strong statement from the Commission. And later on, we generated a draft communique for the PSC that how to term the coup d'etat as an act of terrorism, threatened far-reaching sanctions like listing the author of the coup as terrorists, giving them 96 hours to hand over power to the civilian transition government, or else other sanction would be taken, requesting partners to stop support to them. And we did it knowing fully well then that somehow, Chatham House rules, ECOWAS mediation team was leading towards some kind of compromise with the junta. And we did it on purpose to prevent that from happening. And we knew also that some of our partners, including the EU, well, now I can say, were somehow leaning towards supporting ECOWAS was trying to do, which in our view fell short of the principled position we should have taken. And that was an initiative by the committee. We drafted the communique from A to Z, and we got it adopted as is, and then it was leveraged by the people demonstrating in the street, because of course they made the difference. They used the AU communique to say, you guys are terrorists, and they were emboldened by the EU communique, and eventually the coup failed. I could take Burundi, December 2015. I know we were very much criticized for that, but Of course, we kept issuing communiques in 2015 throughout because of the attempt of then President Nkurunziza to run for a third term based on his interpretation of the constitution, which was validated, by the way, by Burundi Constitutional Court. But we felt otherwise, not so much on account of legal challenges, but because of just the heightened tension this was creating in the country. And throughout the year, we issued communiques to alert at the risk of mass violence in Burundi. And in December 2015, we came up with this decision, which we triggered again as Commission, to deploy an AU mission, MAPROPI, literally, if possible, if necessary, against the will of the sitting government. Obviously, I know it generated a lot of criticism, but the point we made was twofold. One, we highlighted the seriousness of the crisis, clearly. Point number two, we fell short of deploying the mission, but at least eventually the AU was able to deploy human rights and military experts, which played some role, I believe, in containing the situation. Again, I'm giving those examples to say there are ways of literally forcing political will. Is you have to bring the facts to member states. You have to come up with proposals. To give an example, because we're talking about Sudan. The situation there is, of course, where we can't even qualify it. But nothing prevents the AU currently, and there are APSC communiques, by the way, to provide a legal basis for it, from providing a monthly or a bi-monthly report on violations committed against civilians in Sudan. Because there is a APSC communique that, by and large, it could have been framed differently, but provide a basis for that. And what would be the added value of such a communique is member states should not have an excuse to run away from their responsibilities. Of course, other entities are talking about violence in Sudan, but it makes a big difference when Africans themselves are talking about it. And if the AU was to submit that report, say, this is what is obtaining, this is what the AU rules provide for, and challenging member states, I'm not saying that they would take all the steps that are necessary because they are constrained by a host of other factors, but it would somehow, influence the debate, in my view. So again, there is no, we don't have a silver bullet for political will. But my conviction is, as member states' commitment decreases for whatever reasons, the role of the Commission becomes much, much bigger and larger. And when you look at the AU instrument, they all provide for ways of doing stuff. You just need to know how to engineer it, how to use it, in a creative fashion to always, because I remember one thing we did was always to bring to member states their own commitments. And we included, I could read, I can't remember from memory, some of the communiques we drafted. You won't believe that they were issued by the AU. And we were challenged by member states, but every time we were challenged, we tell, well, go to Charter X, go to Article 4 of this and this, this is your own commitment. And they would say, we don't want to. Say, well, we're sorry. This is what the head of state decided to be included in the communique. So there are ways of doing it. Again, I'm not saying it's easy, but my conviction is that there is no single situation. This is valid, by the way, for the UN or any where agency does not exist. There is always some agency, but you have to make use of it. Now, point number two, I think the other question on the issue of, hold on just a second. Yes, resources. That was your question. Yes, they are important. But now, if by resources we refer to AU being able to deploy large peacekeeping missions in the way the UN does it, for me, I would say that's a pointless conversation. Because we had 20 years of APSA. Member states have been unable, I personally believe unwilling, to provide the funding. And that was the case already in the early 2000s. It's even more so today, and it won't change anytime soon. So if by resources we mean the ability for the AU to deploy missions that cost $1 billion or $500 million, I think we'll be waiting for a very long period of time. But there are so many other things we can do that don't require much money. I can tell you. It's in the discourse, it's in the communiques we issue, it's in the speed with which we issue them, the boldness. Some of the ideas we can put forward that literally do not cost, a kopeck. So I think we should focus on that. And even when you go to mediation, it's far less, much cheaper than peacekeeping operations. So there are so many things we could do that do not require resources. That's why I'm always, personally, I don't take the issue of resources as really an issue because I don't know what you're referring to. If you're referring to peacekeeping, forget about it. It won't happen. And even if you mobilize the money, the AU, and I speak as someone who was involved in launching literally 90% of the AU missions. The AU, and who led one of the most complex UN missions, the AU does not have the systems to run these operations. We should not dream. It does not mean it won't. It takes decades and decades and decades of efforts. And the AU does not have a system. Even if you provide the funding, AU cannot run a mission like that. Period. And we should just be realistic. It's not possible. And people who say otherwise really don't know how these missions run. I wish they could be in the field and understand how these missions run. So let's focus on what we can do, which does not cost money. And again, at times, it's just a piece of paper and a communique. It's very easy to be done. Now, last point, what was your last point?
So, in terms of the question from the ambassador of Sudan, is there a tension between suspension and
absolutely not.
Support?
But again, go back to the Lomé Declaration. I'm not even going to the charter. The Lomé Declaration states when there is a coup, or say an unconscious change, a coup is just one form of unconscious change, the chairperson, the Secretary General of the OU then, should immediately issue a communique. Point one. Immediately. It's not optional. Immediately. The PSC should immediately meet to condemn and to suspend. And I insist on the suspending. To suspend. And we should maintain it. But then it also says the chairperson, the Secretary General, should engage and assist the country in restoring constitutional rule. The confusion we often make is to think when you suspend, you no longer engage. It's not true. The whole idea of suspending is to engage, to shorten the suspension as much as we can. And it has been done. Niger in 2010, February, there was a coup. We suspended Niger. But a week later, Commissioner Lamamra, Ginit, who was then the SRSG for UNOWAS, and Shambas were in Niamey, and we supported Niger, and in 10 months or a year, they restored constitutional rule. So there is no contradiction between the two. There is no contradiction at all. Suspension does not mean isolating. Literally, when you suspend, there is even more reason, more rationale to engage the member states concerned to support it in restoring constitutional rule. Of course, in the case of Sudan, it's very complicated because it's not only about constitutional rule, it's about a war that is ongoing and a war that is just causing such a havoc that, even the issue of constitutional rule becomes secondary. I think the urgency is just to stop the fighting in Sudan by all means possible. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. We will have a last round of questions. Anyone? Yes, please. Abdul.
Thank you so much for this fascinating exchange of views. I have two innocent observations and one curious question. The first observation, the innocent observation, is what I'd like to comment on what Ambassador Ginit said, and some of you also commented on it regarding the merger issue. I think to understand the merger issue, and this is my personal reflection, I could be wrong, when President Kagame was entrusted with the reform of the AU, he assembled a panel a panel of advisors, I must say, that was largely composed of bankers and private sector, and was facilitated by one of the most premier consultancy firm global, McKinsey, or I don't know, Ernst & Young. And so the logical outcome of that is cost cutting. Merger means effectiveness, just like a private sector. This is what happens in the corporate world. Therefore, merger was partly discussed in that context. And President Mbeki has written an extensive letter of protest saying that the merger of the security, the peace and security, and the political department is a mistake. And he also argued effectively, I thought, by saying that actually Pan-Africanism is a political project. The identity of the AU is primarily political, and therefore merging it with security dilutes that political identity. But since at that time cost-cutting, efficiency, private sector approach to running multilaterals was rampant, including at the UN, that was overridden. And so what happened as a result of that, and this is again my observation, I could be totally wrong and I stand to be corrected, is that right now the publicly visible activity of the political department has been primarily reduced to election observation. Okay, all the others became footnotes, and we're going to pay a price for it in the long run. So that's an innocent observation. Take it for what it is. But I would like to, in honor of the question raised by a youth representative here, I want to remind you the historical significance of Pan-Africanism. Pan-Africanism transcends the nation states. There was Pan-Africanism before there was A, B, C, D countries until Z, maybe with the exception of one or two countries. But Pan-Africanism was before the nation states, and the nation states, to make sense out of themselves, adopted Pan-Africanism as an organizing principle for their nation state, which they inherited from colonialism. It's a colonial project, the nation state, and therefore Pan-Africanism made it African. And what I want to underline for the youth is simply that all of our Pan-African leaders were youth. From Lumumba to Nkrumah, Sékou Touré, all of these, were in their 20s and their 30s, by and large. The oldest probably was Nkrumah, who was in his mid-30s. So Pan-Africanism was a youth movement. And I think you should inherit that as we try to grapple with our current dilemmas and our current challenges. I think the other, my curious question is, I hope the conventional wisdom today is that the world is undergoing consequential changes. This is not ordinary times. These are gigantic times that is rearranging the global order. And without going into detail, because that will require another panel, organize another meeting for it, but let me just throw two things to comprehend the complexity of the global situation we are undergoing, and we are part of it. One is a quote from somebody I don't want to name, who basically says, there are decades when nothing happens, and there are weeks when decades happen. This is the period we are living in. And the other is, this is also a favorite of Solomon, is that the old is not yet dead and buried, and the new is not yet born. And this is the period when all the evils and the demons come out, and managing that is going to be difficult. That's the time we are living in. So I'm saying this, I am not satisfied by the arguments that this ASPA reform is taking place or is being suggested or is being reflected upon by taking these gigantic changes that are taking place. You know, is this reform primarily driven by political assessments, strategic political assessment, or primarily driven again by technical requirements, by efficiency requirements, by effectiveness requirement as an end in itself without any political guidance to it? I really don't know. Okay, so that's innocent question. So let me conclude by saying the following. Leadership. Okay. If we agree that these are a very trying, complex times, exceptional times, requiring exceptional leadership, I am sad to say that Africa, neither at the national level or at the continental level, we have the leaders that will make it possible for us to navigate these difficult times. Our leaders, by and large, are survivalist because all of them have legitimacy challenges. Therefore, if you have a problem of legitimacy, you are always surviving. When you are surviving in the context of legitimacy challenge, you try to sustain yourself by being somebody requiring external assistance, by being dependent extremely on external support for your survivability. Our leaders are now today unimaginative. They are not people-oriented. They are timid. And they are actually lack the Pan-African commitment to transform. Okay. That's so. All of this reform we are taking, if we can tweak it here, if you can just adjust here, if you can implement more, if we can have more resource, and all of that without taking into account this complex environment will be really miraculous. And good luck.
Thank you very much. That is really very important point. I'm sure members of the panel would have some reflections. Yes, my brother Aziz, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator, and thanks to all the panelists for their very insightful presentations. I want to direct, like Abdul said, please take mine too as a very innocent question, very, very innocent. And please pardon me if this question has been asked before, but when you ask a question repeatedly, it shows the importance of such a question. SRSG 1 eloquently provided the process of dealing with UCGs as enshrined in relevant AU normative frameworks, especially when it's in the the case of coup d'etats. He put it very well. The processes that the AU will be engaged in. But I've not heard him, or I've not heard it anywhere, because just like he said the definition of unconstitutional change is beyond coup d'etats. But I've not heard it anywhere when an incumbent is changing constitution to prolong his stay in power, and we cannot pretend that we don't see this. What process do we take? What do we do to ensure that such things don't happen? But the moment it's a military coup d'etat, we are quick to move to do all the beautiful things that the SRG has just informed us about now. Now, if this persists, what option is left for the population? If there's no coup d'etat, definitely there will be a popular revolt. Which one do we prefer? A coup d'etat or a popular revolt? Because at least for a coup d'etat, you have somebody to talk to. For a popular revolt, in most cases, there are no leaders. And we have seen the consequences on this continent. Not one, not two, and not three. Now, again, this now takes me to what happened in Benin recently, and the efforts of ECOWAS with the support of the Nigerian government. All of us are applauding the Nigerian government for doing that wonderful work. But if we don't address the underlying, so what are we doing? What is ECOWAS doing with the government of Benin to say what is wrong? How did we get here? Everybody seems to be quiet now. We are happy. The coupists have been arrested. Some have run away to some other places, and everything looks okay. It is not okay. It's like a tsunami. If we don't address the underlying problem, we don't need a soothsayer. It will happen again. So what effort is ECOWAS taking, AU, to work with the government of Benin to say, how are you addressing the fundamental root? Because we all saw it when this thing was happening. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I think with those, now I will give the floor to members of the panel for their concluding points very briefly. Of course, engaging also the question, a very profound question from Abdul about, the extent to which we are actually mindful of the gravity and complexity of the moment that we are living in, and how that actually informs whatever reflection that we are having, and what are the imperatives that inform the review process, other than efficiency, other than these technical things so where is the politics basically in all of this? I think that's one. And the 2 points from Aziz about the choice between coup d'etat and revolution. Basically, if people are completely deprived of any constitutional means of changing government, what do you expect them to do other than applauding or instigating military coup, or other than basically being on the street and doing a revolutionary act? So I think let me give the floor back to all of you. I'm not sure if Orit is with us. Orit, are you with us? No, okay. No, Orit, I think she's in another meeting. So let me come back to Ambassador Janet.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, I mean, if I have some comments to make, first on the remarks, very pertinent remarks done by my brother Abdul. Number one, on Pan-Africanism, I mean, and he was right to remind the youth that was youth ambition, Pan-Africanism and the program, not, and then that should be taken up by the youth today. And he's right that this deserves not only one debate, one other round of dialogue, that should command continued engagement of the youth on the issue of Pan-Africanism and what needs to be done to revive Pan-Africanism. In the 60s and 70s, there were already some events to celebrate Pan-Africanism in all African countries, but this has stopped, and I think there is a need to renew that sense of Pan-Africanism by taking initiatives. And he has a point on that. Second, also, he had the point on questioning whether the reform we are talking about is a technical reform, that means for technical reasons, as in the first case, or is it something deeper and more political? And of course, and I have something to say about this. As one made it clear, all what we have seen till today in terms of the architecture of the AU in governance, peace and security draws from the initial document of the 1990 Declaration of July 1990 on the fundamental changes in the world and Africa's response. At that time, there was the end of colonization and a new world was emerging, and the end of the so-called Cold War, and Africa should reposition itself, because what is its purpose? There is no more decolonization, almost not. And now how to bring Africa together based on a different agenda. And the new agenda was set in the 1990 declaration. All you to have seen since then till today is in that declaration. And I urge all interested to go to revisit and to read that declaration, and they will see that democracy, governance, constitutional core, all that is provided. It was only a matter of unpacking, depending on the political dynamics in the continent, and we have been maneuvering based on what could be done at what point, and till we reached the African Union, and then the implementation of the PSC, of the protocol of the African Union Constitutive Act and the protocol, etc. Next is on the unconstitutional changes of government. Yeah, what I wanted to say, the reform of 1990 was based on a very deep debate, exchange within the AU. I must admit that in the period of 18 years and a half at the OAU-AU, I have seen only one single deep debate that took the organization till early morning, like 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. It was in July 1990 about the document that we have proposed, suggesting a new agenda. Since then, I have never attended any serious debate on where we are aiming at going. There was no such serious debate. Otherwise, member states are called to meetings and to discuss technical issues on the agenda. 1, 2, 3, they react, yes, no, and make some suggestions. There are some elements of debate sometimes, but not a properly organized debate on who we are, where are we going, and what are we aiming to achieve together. The issue of the unconstitutional changes of government. I think a number of colleagues have again raised the issue of what you expect when Africa and the AU has failed to address the governance issues that led to a coup d'etat, precisely because the part on governance of the Lomé Declaration was not sufficiently developed. It is important to remind that when you went to 1990 in Lomé with the draft declaration, Lomé Declaration, we had 5 categories of coup d'etats that constitute coup d'etats. 1, 2, 3, and the fifth one was manipulation of constitution to retain power. That was already in the initial draft, but unfortunately the ambassadors, and I think at some point the role of ambassadors and the PRC in the decision, in the preparation of documents needs to be discussed, because sometimes we miss the point, because by being extremely prudent, sometimes we we prevent our organization to move forward. So that part of our proposal was removed, and we have been trying to put it back, and I hope that it could be restated in the Charter on Governance in 2007, that was not restored completely. There was a reference to that in a such language that did not prevent any manipulation of constitution to happen. So I think that aspect of governance should be strengthened as the AU should and need to review its policy on unconstitutional changes of government, because indeed, when the AU failed or the ECOWAS failed to address the issue of manipulation of government, of rigging of election, obviously, then the ground is there for a coup d'etat, and then we condemn it. You know, that's something that needs to be addressed. And finally, my last point is actually the point I want to make first, is the issue of political commitment, which was central to our today's discussion. We have been saying that the political will has been declining. And one has made the point that the Commission has a greater role to play precisely when the political will is not there. And he has absolutely a point on that. But I want to say, although we have been saying that there was political will at the beginning, we cannot say that it has been always there in strength. I can tell you that we had always to remind member states with their own commitment. In 2000, we went to Lomé to adopt the declaration, the Lomé Declaration on constitutional changes of government, and that was 2000. 2001, at the summit in Lusaka, a number of countries have taken the floor and have made the point for for Comoros, which was suspended at that time, and they pleaded for the removal of sanctions on Comoros, while Comoros has not yet restored constitutional order. It has, the Commission, the Secretary General at that time, the Secretariat, had to recall member states of their commitment, and the position of the group of 10 countries that supported the restoration of the situation of Comoros were not supported by the chair, because the Secretariat reminded the Commission of their commitment. I can tell you that whenever, and there was always, even at the beginning of the AU, there have been times when the member states, for their own convenience, political convenience, wanted to get out of the commitment. But the African Union Commission has always been there to remind, and I can tell you that the majority of member states appreciate the role of the Commission when it reminds the membership of its commitment. That's why I agree again, the role of the Commission to mobilize to remind member states of their commitment, to mobilize the energy and to galvanize the member states is more needed when that commitment at national level has been lowered because of a number of reasons, including the current international and continental context. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Janet. Let me start on the far left side, Paul, and then we come this way. Final thoughts.
Thank you very much. It's difficult to wrap up these discussion, but I would like to come back to what some of the issues that our friend Abdul innocently raised. Always be worried of people who say they have innocent questions. I think you raised the important point of the context in which this reform is happening, the global context. And I think this is a fundamental point, because Africa does not exist in a vacuum. We are part of this world, and we are influenced by development in the world as much as we also can influence development themselves. Let me take two questions that these global context calls in my mind. The first is we're talking about reform and we actively pushing towards the implementation of the EFCTA, for example, at a time actually where economic liberalism is facing the biggest attacks of its existence. We're back actually to protectionism, not to liberalism. What does that say about our EFCTA? Should we continue with the same enthusiasm? Because the software for it was actually generated in a completely different global context. That's a question. The other one is about the UN Security Council. African voices are pushing for a larger UN Security Council at a time where actually the very existence of the UN is being questioned. How efficient will be a bigger UN Security Council when it cannot be more efficient with just, okay, I'm talking about the P5, with 5 permanent members. So enlarging it, will it make it more efficient? If it doesn't, actually, then important decisions will leave the UN and going to be taken elsewhere in some form of global governance. That is a danger, but it just reminds us that while we review, we change commas and points here in our APSA and AGA. Let's look at the bigger context and also make sure that what we do is a response to what's happening globally. And then the last point is on constitutional changes of government. And I think it has been said, one thing that needs to be reviewed, maybe not reviewed, but we need to go back to the basics because there are provisions for it. The application of the suspension regime has given the feeling, the perception that the AU was actually just protecting incumbent president. That the problem was the military coup. The problem was not apparently the bad governance or the conditions that could lead to coup. It's a perception, and it's something that needs to be corrected because, as we see with the with what's happening in the Sahel, with the coup wave, the credibility of both regional organizations, ECOWAS in West Africa, and the AU has been shattered by this perception of selective engagement when a coup happened. Thank you.
Kevin, please.
Thank you very much. I'd like to say a couple of things. One is that the reform agenda of the union and all other aspects of it, I think, is a welcome development. And we might have debates on how to carry out the reform process, but I think it's good. What I wouldn't disagree with, what I would disagree with, is on whether to have the reform agenda or not. The one thing that, speaking now as a Kenyan from the champion's perspective, is that sometimes you're seeing resistance to the idea of reforms or reforming the union. And that risks sending a negative message to our own citizens, but also a negative message to our interlocutors. Dr. Paul makes reference to the fact that whenever someone is campaigning for elections in Africa, they rarely bring up the AU as I'll advance the AU's agenda. And partly it's because maybe the citizens are not quite in touch with the whole AU project. The idea of UCGs, yes, I'm sure if we have to do a straw poll, most of our mainly young people will think that, hang on, this is a club that is self-preserving. And therefore, reform is essential, not just for the sake of it, but also for the people in whose name the AU was formed. The second thing that I want to talk about is about funding the union. I think this is a very critical point. Yes, there are some things within the continent fall under the Chapter 7 mandate of the UN Security Council. We couldn't raise $1 billion, for example, to fund AMISOM. That's where we need to hold the UNSC's feet to the fire and say, look, you need to fund some of these things. But we are now living in a different time. It will say that, decades don't happen, and then all of a sudden you have weeks where decades happen. I think we're in that particular moment where, to quote Minister Hanif and his panelists who are assisting the champion, they keep telling us we are now on our own. We have to look for ways of funding our own programs. We may not be able to successfully fund those billion-dollar projects, but what do? We cannot fold our arms and say, hey, let our people suffer. Let us do something. And when you fund the union, not to the maximum, but when you show the willingness to fund your own operations, you're also sending a positive message to other interlocutors who may want to come in. We've had questions actually where we've interacted with some donors, and they keep asking us, you guys have a bit of money in the peace fund. What are you doing with it? So people are saying, hey, you have money, why don't you use it? So it's this kind of ability to think beyond external help that will see us moving forward. Otherwise, Dr. Solomon, I want to thank you for the invitation on behalf of Dr. Korir Sing'oei, and I want to thank you again for keeping the fire burning on issues of Africa. Thank you very much.
So much for joining us, and also for the leadership that you are providing of Kenya. Mr. One, please.
Thank you. Maybe just two suggestions for the champion. To me, two ideas, which maybe what I read, I just read quickly, so I apologize if they are already integrated. But simple thing that depend on Africa. Number one, of course, we need to reflect, reform where necessary, but there is one basic requirement, which, if not met, mean that all these efforts will lead to nothing. And the simple thing is, our leaders should take our institution more seriously. I explain myself. Simple. We had the ticket. All of our leaders were there. We had the Africa EU summit. They were all there. Africa EU. Obviously, for the signing, many leaders went. I can tell you, February is in 2 months' time. It's likely you won't even get half of the head of state to their own summit. So, and for me, that the most visible aspect of commitment, again, it costs nothing of a cost, price of a ticket, or maybe a special plane. So if President Ruto could include in his report the preface, all what I'm proposing makes only sense if we take ourselves and our institution seriously. And the first visible proof that we're taking our institution seriously and taking ourselves seriously is to attend the meetings of our own institution and stay in Addis Ababa until the end of the proceedings. I'm an old, I have stayed in the OAU and AU for very long to know how it works. When you go to the last day of the summit, often you have the chair, the president who has been elected chair, and the chairperson of the commission. Many of the ambassadors are not even there. You have first secretaries or second secretaries. So this one, I'm saying, it's not the imperialists, it's not the colonialists who are preventing us from doing it. It depends on us. Correct? So sorry for the imperialists and colonialists in the room. But I'm just saying, we blame you for so many things, but this one, I'm sure you're not demarching our head of states to tell them don't attend AU summits. I'm certain you're not doing it. So could President Ruto put point number one let's take our institutions seriously. Obviously, they would say, well, the agenda, well, they are the bosses. If they're not happy with the agenda, they can trash it and change it. If they're not happy with the commission, they can change it. It's up to them. But self-respect starts by attending our own summits. And especially, I can tell you again, out of experience, we say they have been to Japan. I think Japanese promise, I don't know how many billions, but let's be frank. If really foreign aid was developing Africa, it would not be where we are. None of those outside partners can develop Africa. So I think that point number one. Yes, really for him to really to strongly. And then, of course, to lead by example by staying in the summit up to the end. Yes, okay. Point number two, which should appear, he should also say that all these efforts to reform make only sense if they have an impact on people's life. Because the people, again, I come back to Sudan because I really am truly traumatized by Sudan. And I believe that Africa has really let Sudan down and Sudanese people down. All these reforms, if I'm in El Fasher, or I'm in Kadugli, or I'm in, I don't know, in Nuba Mountain, it means nothing to me. Because what I want is a difference in my life. So I would like the report to say that at all these discussions, all these efforts at reforms make only sense if the AU is if they are not done at the expense of the field work to bring conflicts to an end. And I insist we don't have time to talk about it. Obviously, Africa on its own cannot bring the war in Sudan to an end, or many of the other conflicts we witness, but believe me, there is so much we can do as Africans. We're not powerless, contrary to perceptions, but we can discuss it later. Last point, it was just to say on the issue of UCGs, just to react to what Said said on UCGs. In fact, the issue of the so-called civilian coups was addressed not as perfectly as one would wish by the African Charter, because there is a slight difference. You had a stronger provision. Member states, in fact, 2 member states, to be frank, oppose that specific provision. But what we have is already good enough. And when you read the Charter, it says, constitute inter alia. The location inter alia there, it means the list is not a final list. It's up to the PSC to apply it to situations where it deems that indeed, a UCG has happened. And last, the other complement is that the Malabo Protocol went further. It revised that definition. But for the Malabo Protocol to apply, it has to be ratified. Only Angola has ratified it 12 years after it was adopted in Malabo. Again, these are commitments that cost no money to ratify. You just take it to Parliament. No one is preventing us from doing it. We can't blame no one. So then I would just say, let's really talk or walk the talk. And there are simple, cost-free, literally political-free steps we can take. Our head of state attending summits, which wholly depend on us. And let's start with that. And believe me, once we do that, people will take us more seriously. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, Minister, please.
Merci beaucoup. Moi, j'ai juste 2 choses à dire. Je crois que le frère Abdoul, on ne peut pas parler mieux que ce que le frère Abdoul a dit tout à l'heure, à moins qu'on fasse la politique de l'Autriche. Et c'est pour cela que j'avais, dès le départ, dit que ce dont nous souffrons aujourd'hui, c'est une crise de leadership. Pour nous autres qui assistons au débat de l'OUA, de l'Union africaine, février dernier.
Last February, it's been 2-3 years. For me, I'm really amazed with the level of debates that I'm seeing. So the crisis that Mr. Abdul talked about right now as a leadership crisis and also a crisis related to our Pan-African commitment. I remember during our meetings with the champion, we said it. This is actually a leadership crisis. This is a crisis on our Pan-African commitments because this is it's all about just taking the speeches of our founding fathers of 1963 and try to compare them to what we are saying today so that you can understand the gaps that divide us, from the founding fathers, from, OAU. They did not have too much studies, you know, when it comes to our ways of thinking, we should really think about that leadership crisis, the crisis on how the Pan-Africanism is not really being valued as it should be. When it comes to our instruments, we always have a very relevant instrument, instruments that just require implementation. These instruments are not necessarily binding. I definitely agree with the person that talked about the coup d'etat in Niger in other countries. For me, I'd like to give you an example that we've lived in Mauritania, related to the suspension. My brother from Sudan talked about it. In 2009, we had a coup d'etat in Mauritania, and Abdulaziz was the one who carried it. I would like to tell you that for Mauritania becomes able to go back to the constitutional order, this is where, with the leadership, I found myself with Mambra, with Guinea, where we had to be in a room equally to this one, and where Abdoulaye said, I don't want to come back to power, even if you give me back that power. And I would like to be allowed for 10 minutes to thank Mauritania for electing me, but also to tell them that I'm resigning. In this such environment, you have the Constitutional Council, the Supreme Court, and Abdoulaye came and made a speech that was not more than 1 minute. He thanked all the people from Mauritania to tell them that I leave this power, and immediately the Constitutional Council understood that he left the power on spot in the same room. The president of the Supreme Court, the president of Senate, if the president resigns, immediately it was understood that the next day the Council of the AU gathered to say that they went back to the constitutional order because the president of the Senate is going to now take the presidency in 45 days, is going to organize elections, and the next day the council is going to gather and to go back to the constitutional order. That means we have a level of of uh, of uh, of coherence with our constitutions, but it's the problem of our leaders that want to sustain themselves on power. So this is for you to again question our past. Our brother said it. Repetitions help us to learn better. This is very important to say it. It is a good example. And as an example today, Mauritania is facing a different cycle. And I would like to conclude by saying one more time, thank you very much, Dr. Solomon. Thank you to Amani Africa for this quality debate where we're able to question ourselves. This is the type of debate that we need. And I think this is going to help us with different types of reflections. I thank you.
Now, I stand between you and lunch, so I will not try to keep you very long. Let me start by expressing gratitude. Let me start by expressing gratitude. I would like to express my deep gratitude to each of the members of the panel for making time and also generously sharing their rich insights and expertise to help us come to grips with this question of the reform of the African peace and security architecture and that of the African governance architecture. I also wish to thank you, the participants, for honoring our invitation and gracing this event with your presence, but also with your very enriching reflections, questions, and also participation. I would like to thank, of course, also the participants online. Although I was asking whether there was anyone who wants to intervene or ask question, we didn't have any request for question or intervention, but there are a number of participants joining us online as well. I would like to thank them as well. I also wish to thank my colleagues at Amani Africa, who continue to inspire me, inspire each other in the work that we do at Amani Africa. I'm sure some of them may disagree with what he said when he said that we are not doing our work. I'm sure they would disagree that it's just that you are not reading our work. Our work actually does exactly what you are saying, going back to what the AU has been doing, what the norms actually say, and the failure is actually in not really engaging those kinds of activities. So wish to thank Sisai, Robel, Tafsat here, Priven, Brooke, and the glue in the house, Yerukso. That is the lady who keeps us together and keeps us going with her wisdom and patience. Thank you very much, Yeruk. This organization wouldn't have been possible without her. So please join me in thanking Yeruk. I also wish to once again acknowledge our partners, particularly the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Switzerland. Now, I will say a few words in recognition and appreciation of the depth and richness of what has been said. First, the reform process was initiated at a completely different time from the time when this reform process continues to be implemented. And the implication of that is so significant. Initially, indeed, it was financial commitments going back to the decision of June 2015 of Assembly decision that triggered the conversation and the process of reform. But today we stand at a completely transformed juncture, both continentally but also globally. Continentally, many of you mentioned the point that we are at an inflection point. Early in the year, in our review of the AU and the peace and security landscape on the continent, we said that Africa has now entered a new era of insecurity and instability. It manifests itself not just by the number of conflicts that have spread wide across the continent, not just by the severity of the impact of these conflicts that are having their unprecedented toll on the lives and livelihoods of ordinary people, as exemplified by what's happening in Sudan. The new era of insecurity and instability is characterized also not just by unconstitutional change of government and the resurgence of military coups, but also by a major regression in democratization on the African continent. And this new era of insecurity and instability is also characterized by a spike in tensions between states. Tensions between states. Borders are being challenged today. That is another manifestation of this new era of insecurity, unprecedented in the AU. And, of course, regional orders are fragmenting and collapsing. It's not just the withdrawal of the 3 Sahelian countries. The state of health of regional organizations across the continent is something that is symptomatic of also this new era of insecurity. It's only the day before yesterday that Eritrea announced its withdrawal from the regional body, Intergovernmental Authority on Development, IGAD. Rwanda withdrew from ECAS. And the state of health of interstate relationship on the continent is a major issue that we need really to pay attention to. And globally, Abdul put it so eloquently. So what this means is that we cannot proceed with the reform in a business as usual fashion. Absolutely not. Unless, in other words, we want to completely, throw the baby with the bathwater. That would be the end of the continental body. So, in terms of, therefore, moving forward, there are very serious challenges that we need to contend with. But there are also possibilities that the members of the panel clearly articulated. We need to come to grips with the challenge of the decline and erosion of the Pan-African commitment and Pan-Africanism. That is actually the foundation for all of the programs of the African Union. Without greater commitment to Pan-Africanism, it would be impossible to make any progress on the reform agenda. And therefore, Kevin, you are absolutely right. The resistance or the lack of enthusiasm for the reform, part of it has to do with this lack of Pan-African commitment. And there is a need for actually addressing that. The question of leadership, absolutely. It's at the core of it. The existence of a core group of leaders was critical for the transition from the OAU to the African Union. But it's not just the existence of a core group of leaders that was critical. Those were also leaders who had a deeper level of rapport between each other. And that deeper level of rapport between each other allowed them to criticize each other. To criticize each other without being disagreeable, without basically, going against each other. Do we have now those core group of leaders with a Pan-African vision and commitment, willing and able to put at the disposal of the commitment, at the disposal of the continent, their national institutions and political and diplomatic resources? I'm not saying that it's completely empty. There are those definitely who are doing that. But how connected are they? Most of all, do they have the kind of rapport that they are willing to see eye to eye and tell each other, no, you are doing the wrong thing here. There is a possibility to do it differently. When did we see that happening? Then you have the question of the institutional leadership. Absolutely. Ambassador Janet said it, once said it, when political commitment is weaker on the part of states, there's always a question, who steps in? And it is the African Union Commission. Is the Commission stepping up at the level that this moment actually requires. The example of Salim Ahmed Salem, it was not requested by, but he understood the imperative responsibility that the moment brought on him, and he did leadership that set the stage for all the change that happened in the 90s up to the transition from the OAU to the African Union. Is this not the kind of moment, much more actually consequential, that requires not just what Salim did, even more than what Salim did? But where is that? Is part of the question that we are asking. We talked a lot about political leadership and political commitment and political will. Indeed, it has to be leveraged, it has to be negotiated, it has to be created. And how do you go about doing that? First, through a compelling technical analysis that you put forward. And it is for the AU Commission to take leadership on this one. And second, it is through the articulation of robust, diplomatically astute strategy on the issues that need to be addressed. And third, and most importantly, it is the work of diplomacy and the work of political action. That is basically engaging each member state and identify from those member states which ones you can actually enlist towards nudging them and pushing them into taking difficult but necessary collective decisions that move the agenda forward. Is that how we are actually doing the political action and diplomatic work at the moment? Leveraging normative instruments, as Ambassador said, Janet said, that one of the obligations of the Commission is to defend and uphold the normative and policy instruments of the African Union. Remind member states that what they are expected to do, as inconvenient as it is basically APSA because of the commitment that they have made. Instead of basically throwing our hands up in the air, saying that, well, member states. And finally, on unconstitutional change of government, I think the idea of push is made possible because inconsistent application of the norms, because of the lack of full application of the norms, particularly when it comes to governance and democratic deficit. And another thing that happened is when you do not deal with the erosion of democratic principles and norms at the national level, and when constitutions are completely ripped apart through the practice of incumbents, then the support from people for the norm of anti-coup, for the anti-coup norm that bars coup d'etat, the support of people on the ground for a norm that prevents or that opposes coup d'etat would decline. And that's exactly what happened. People used to support the AU's norm against coups. They no longer support it. Why? Because, as Addis rightly pointed out, that became the only avenue for getting rid of what people do not want. It's not because they want military leadership or dictatorship. And that, therefore, means that the idea of merging needs to be rethought of. The merger of political affairs and peace and security, the merger of AGA and APSA needs to be seriously rethought, including in the context of the global major shifts that are happening, that require us actually to have an African Union common policy on global affairs or on foreign affairs. With that, I would like now to once again thank everybody and each of you. This is the last of our event for the year, and we are extremely grateful for all of you joining us in this journey during 2025. Let's hope that 2026 will not be as agonizing as 2025. And I wish you all a happy holiday season. And may God help us all to make it easy for people in Al-Fashar, for people in Sahel, for people in Eastern DRC, and those in between. Thank you all very much again.